My husband leaned into the glass partition of the county jail visitation room and whispered 3 words that were supposed to break me. Rot in prison. He did not look sad. He did not look like a man whose wife had just been arrested for embezzlement. He looked like a man who had just won the lottery. He smiled a cruel twisting of his lips that showed too many teeth and tapped the glass with his wedding ring. "Me and Chloe will blow through all your money," he said, his voice low and vibrating with malicious excitement. "I found your stash, Aaliyah. The $50,000 in the shoebox under the floorboards. Gone. We are going to burn through it this weekend while you sit here and think about what you did." He sat back looking satisfied, waiting for me to scream or cry or beg. He expected the quiet, submissive data entry clerk he had married 5 years ago. He expected the woman who drove a dented 2015 Honda Civic and clipped coupons for groceries. He had absolutely no idea who he was actually talking to. He thought that $50,000 was my life savings. He did not know it was just the petty cash I kept on hand for emergencies. And he definitely did not know that by framing me and putting me in this cell, he had just initiated a fail-safe protocol in my blind trust that would leave him homeless and bankrupt by sunrise. Before I tell you how I turned his victory lap into his funeral march, let me know where you are watching from in the comments. And if you have ever been underestimated by a partner who thought they were smarter than you, hit that like and subscribe button. You are going to want to see exactly how this plays out. The fluorescent lights of the Fulton County Jail interrogation room hummed with a headache-inducing buzz. The air smelled of industrial bleach and old sweat. My hands were not cuffed, but they felt heavy as they rested on the cold metal table. Dante sat across from me wearing the navy blue suit I had bought him for his promotion interview 3 years ago. He looked polished, handsome to the outside world, but I could see the fraying threads on the cuff. I could see the anxiety behind his eyes that he was trying to mask with arrogance. He was desperate. I knew about the gambling debts. I knew about the crypto scams he had fallen for. I knew he was drowning, and instead of asking for help, he had decided to use me as his life raft. "You are quiet," Dante said, mocking my silence. "Saving your breath for the judge. It won't help." I gave the police the hard drive, Aaliyah, the one with the altered spreadsheets. I told them how you cooked the books at my company, how you stole from us to fund your secret little stash. I stared at him, my expression unmoving. It was fascinating in a clinical sort of way to watch a man dig his own grave with such enthusiasm. He was referring to the accounting work I did on the weekends for his logistics firm. He thought I was just a glorified bookkeeper. He did not know that my real job, the one that paid me 7 figures a year, was as a forensic auditor for the FBI and private equity firms. I hunted hidden assets for a living. I found money that warlords and CEOs tried to hide, and Dante thought he could frame me with a sloppy Excel spreadsheet. I did not steal anything, Dante. I said, my voice calm, contrasting sharply with his manic energy. He laughed, a sharp barking sound that made the guard by the door look over. "Save it," he said. "Jessica and Mom are already at the house. They are packing up your things. Jessica found the vintage jewelry you hid in the vents. She says thank you, by the way. She always wanted a Cartier bracelet." Something cold tightened in my chest. It wasn't fear. It was rage. Pure, distilled rage. Jessica, his sister-in-law, had sneered at me for years. She made fun of my natural hair. She made fun of my clothes. And now she was in my house, touching my things, thinking she had finally won. "You let them in the house," I stated, not asking a question. "It is my house now," Dante sneered. "As soon as your conviction goes through, I get power of attorney. I get it all, Aaliyah. The house, the car, that 50 grand, and whatever else you have squirreled away. Chloe is moving in tonight. She is going to redecorate the master bedroom. She says your taste is too drab." He leaned forward again, his eyes gleaming with cruelty. Chloe, the 24-year-old assistant he had been sleeping with for 6 months. He thought I didn't know. He thought the late nights at the office and the sudden business trips were convincing. He underestimated my intelligence so profoundly it was almost insulting. "You are going to bring your mistress into our bed while I am in jail?" I asked, keeping my voice steady. He stood up, buttoning his jacket. He felt big. He felt powerful. He felt like the man of the house for the first time in his life, fueled by the delusion that he had finally outsmarted me. "She is not my mistress anymore, Aaliyah," he said, looking down at me. "She is the woman who appreciates me. She is the woman who doesn't nag me about budgets. Enjoy the bologna sandwiches. I will think of you when we are spending your cash at the Ritz this weekend." He turned and walked toward the heavy steel door. He walked with a bounce in his step. He thought the game was over. He thought checkmate had been called. I watched his back as he waited for the guard to buzz him out. I did not yell. I did not plead. I simply waited until the door clicked open. "Dante," I said. He paused, looking back over his shoulder, expecting a tearful apology. "Make sure you keep the receipts," I said. "You are going to need them for the audit." He frowned, confused for a split second before shaking his head and laughing. He walked out the heavy door, slamming shut behind him with a finality that echoed in the small room. I sat alone in the silence. The $50,000 he found was bait. I had left it there on purpose, knowing that sooner or later, his greed would overpower his caution. He had taken the bait. He had brought his family into the scheme. He had involved the police. He had just elevated a domestic dispute into a federal crime. I closed my eyes and took a deep breath. I was not trapped in here with them. They were trapped out there with me. And Dante had just made the biggest mistake of his life. He had forgotten that I wasn't just Aaliyah the wife. I was Aaliyah the auditor, and the audit had just begun. 48 hours before I was sitting in a jail cell being mocked by my husband, I was standing in the foyer of his brother's mansion in Buckhead. It was a sprawling estate with marble columns and a driveway filled with leased luxury cars, the kind of place designed to scream wealth while whispering debt. We were there for Jessica and Marcus's 5th wedding anniversary. Jessica, my sister-in-law, had insisted on a black tie theme, mostly because she wanted an excuse to wear a gown she couldn't afford and look down on anyone who didn't meet her standards. I stood near a towering arrangement of white lilies, clutching a glass of sparkling water. I was wearing a simple, elegant, cream-colored dress I had bought off the rack at Macy's 3 years ago. It was practical. It was modest. And in this room full of sequins and rented tuxedos, it made me invisible. That was exactly how I liked it. My husband Dante was on the other side of the room holding court with a group of potential investors or victims, depending on how you looked at his business model. He was laughing too loud, his arm draped casually over the back of a velvet sofa, looking every bit the successful entrepreneur he pretended to be. I watched him with a professional detachment that had become my default state over the last year. I was analyzing the room the same way I analyzed a suspicious ledger. I saw the cracks in the facade that no one else noticed. I saw that the catering staff were actually students paid under the table, not the high-end service Jessica claimed to have hired. I noticed that the art on the walls was generic hotel-grade prints in expensive frames. And I knew, because I had run a soft background check on my brother-in-law Marcus last week, that this house was 3 months behind on mortgage payments. But to everyone else, this was the peak of success. And I was just Aaliyah, the boring wife who worked data entry and drove a Honda. A shadow fell over me. I turned to see Jessica approaching. She was wearing a crimson-red gown that dragged on the floor, holding a glass of heavy Cabernet. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a tight bun that pulled her eyes upward, giving her a permanent look of surprise and judgment. She didn't smile when she looked at me. She scanned me from head to toe, her eyes lingering on my sensible heels and the lack of jewelry on my neck. "Hello, Aaliyah," she said, her voice dripping with that specific brand of southern sweetness that is actually venom. "I almost didn't see you standing there. You blend right in with the wallpaper." I forced a polite smile. "Happy anniversary, Jessica. The house looks beautiful." She swirled her wine, taking a step closer, invading my personal space. She smelled of expensive perfume and insecurity. "Thank you," she said. "Marcus and I wanted everything to be perfect. We invited some very important people tonight, people who can really help Dante's career. It is so crucial that he makes a good impression." She paused, taking a sip of wine, her eyes locking onto mine over the rim of the glass. It is a shame he has to work so hard to compensate, she added, her voice dropping to a theatrical whisper. Compensate for what I asked, though I knew exactly where this was going. For his home life, she said, gesturing vaguely at my outfit. You know appearances matter in this world, Aaliyah. Dante is trying to build an empire. He needs a queen by his side, not whatever this is. I tightened my grip on my water glass. This was the dynamic. This had always been the dynamic. Jessica, the former pageant girl who married into the family, felt the need to assert dominance over the quiet black woman who kept to herself. She needed me to be small so she could feel big. I think Dante is doing just fine, I said calmly. Jessica laughed a brittle sound. Oh, honey, he is drowning, and we all know why. He has to carry the weight of 2 people. It must be so exhausting for him coming home to someone who just exists. She took a step back, feigning a stumble. It happened in slow motion. Her hand jerked forward, the glass of Cabernet tilted. I saw the dark red liquid arc through the air before I could move. It splashed across my chest, soaking into the cream fabric of my dress, running down my stomach like a fresh wound. The glass didn't break, but the damage was done. Gasps rippled through the nearby crowd. The conversation died instantly. I stood there, the cold wine seeping through to my skin, looking down at the ruined dress. Jessica brought a hand to her mouth, her eyes wide with fake shock. Oh my God, she squealed loud enough for the entire room to hear. I am so clumsy, I am so sorry, Aaliyah. She grabbed a cocktail napkin and made a half-hearted attempt to dab at my shoulder. But she was smiling. I could see it in the corners of her eyes. It wasn't an accident. It was a territorial marking. I stepped back, pushing her hand away gently. It is fine, Jessica. It is just a dress. She let out a sigh of relief that sounded more like a scoff. Well, that is a relief. I mean, look at the bright side. At least it was cheap, right? It's not like it was silk or anything. I'm sure you can pick up another one at the discount store tomorrow. The room rippled with uncomfortable laughter. I looked across the room for Dante, my husband, the man who was supposed to protect me. He was standing near the fireplace watching. He didn't rush over. He didn't look angry at his sister-in-law. He looked embarrassed. He looked at me with disdain, as if my stained dress was a personal failing of his. He turned his back and resumed his conversation with a potential client. That stung more than the wine. I felt a hand on my arm. I turned to see Lucille, my mother-in-law. She was a small woman with iron gray hair and eyes that missed nothing. She was wearing a sequined jacket that cost more than my car paid for, I assumed by Dante's recent credit card limit increase. I thought for a second she was going to offer me a towel or a kind word. You should go to the kitchen and clean yourself up, Lucille said, her voice low and hard. You are making a scene. I stared at her. Jessica spilled wine on me, I said quietly. And you were standing in the way, Lucille snapped. Look at you. You look like a disaster. Dante is trying to close a deal with the vice president of logistics over there. Do you think he wants that man to see his wife looking like this? She gestured at the stain with a manicured hand. Dante needs a partner, Aaliyah, she continued, leaning in close so only I could hear. He needs a woman who knows diplomacy, a woman who knows how to navigate a room like this, not a mouse who rucks in the corner and attracts mess. He needs someone who brings something to the table besides bills. I looked from Lucille to Jessica, who was now holding court with a group of women reenacting the spill with dramatic gestures. They were laughing. They thought I was pathetic. They thought I was a charity case that Dante had picked up and was now stuck with. The heat rose in my cheeks, but I didn't let it reach my eyes. I had trained for this. In my line of work, when you are auditing a cartel boss or a corrupt senator, you cannot show emotion. You have to be a stone. I will go clean up, I said, my voice steady. I walked through the crowd head high, ignoring the whispers. I found the guest bathroom down the hall, a lavish space with gold fixtures and monogrammed towels. I locked the door and leaned against the marble counter, staring at my reflection. The red stain looked violent against the cream fabric. I looked at the woman in the mirror. They saw a victim. They saw a mouse. My phone buzzed against the marble countertop. It was a single short vibration. I picked it up. The screen lit up with a notification from a secure app that looked like a generic calculator. I entered my biometric passkey. The interface shifted, revealing a sleek, dark dashboard. It was a direct message from my contact at the Zurich Cantonal Bank. The message was short. Transaction complete. Acquisition of debt portfolio, Archer Logistics and Holdings. Status 100% ownership transfer. Controlling party. Ghost Shell LLC. I read it twice. Archer Logistics was Dante's company, or rather the company Dante worked for and owned a minority stake in. But the real news was the holdings part. That included the debt, the massive, crippling corporate debt that the company had leveraged to expand. I tapped the screen, opening the details. The purchase price was $12 million, a bargain for the leverage it gave me. I scrolled down to the list of personal guarantors on the company loans. There, right at the top, was Dante's signature, and below it, a co-signer for the collateral, Marcus Hayes, Jessica's husband. I looked at the phone, then back at my reflection. The red wine stain didn't look like a mark of shame anymore. It looked like war paint. I had just bought the mortgage on the house I was standing in. I had just bought the debt that kept Dante's career afloat. I owned the chair Jessica was sitting on. I owned the wine she was drinking. I owned the very air they were breathing, and they didn't have a clue. I typed a quick reply, execute stage 1, hold notification until authorized. I put the phone back in my clutch. I grabbed a towel, ran it under cold water, and dabbed at the stain. It wouldn't come out, but it didn't matter. I wasn't going to hide in the kitchen. I unlocked the door and walked back out into the party. The music had swelled, a jazz quartet playing something upbeat. Jessica was still by the bar. When she saw me, her smile faltered slightly. She expected me to have left or to be crying in a back room. Instead, I walked straight to the bar right past her. "Another sparkling water, please," I told the bartender. Jessica leaned in, her eyes narrowing. "You are still here. That stain looks awful." I turned to her, and for the first time that night, I smiled. A real, genuine smile that reached my eyes. It was the smile of a wolf watching a lamb graze near the edge of a cliff. "It is okay, Jessica," I said, my voice clear and carrying over the music. "I decided you were right. It is a cheap dress. In fact, everything here is a little precarious, isn't it? You never know when things might just spill over and ruin everything." She frowned, not understanding the double meaning. She opened her mouth to throw another insult, but I had already turned away. I scanned the room and found Dante. He was looking at me, annoyed that I was still visible. I raised my glass of water to him in a mock toast. "Enjoy the party, my love," I whispered to myself. "It is the last one you will ever afford." Lucille was watching me from a seated position near the window. She looked confused by my sudden change in demeanor. She saw the mouse stand up straight. She didn't know the mouse had just become the exterminator. I took a sip of water, the bubbles sharp on my tongue. The humiliation of the wine spill was gone, replaced by the cold, hard weight of absolute power. They had 48 hours left of this fantasy, and I was going to enjoy watching every single second of their ignorance before I pulled the rug out from under the entire world they thought they owned. The blue lights flashing against my bedroom blinds were the first warning. They cut through the darkness of the master bedroom, slicing across the ceiling in a rhythmic, nauseating strobe. I sat up in bed, my heart hammering against my ribs, looking at the digital clock. It was 2:17 in the morning. Beside me, the bed was empty. Dante had said he was staying late at the office to finish the quarterly projections. He said he needed focus. I reached for my glasses on the nightstand, my mind racing through possibilities. Fire. A car accident outside. But then came the sound that freezes the blood of anyone who grew up in a neighborhood like the one I fought so hard to leave. It was the heavy, authoritative pounding of a fist against the front door. "Open up, police!" The shout was muffled by the walls but unmistakable. I threw off the covers, grabbing my silk robe, the one I had bought in Paris during a solo trip 3 years ago. I tied it tight around my waist, trying to armor myself against whatever nightmare was waiting downstairs. I didn't even make it to the landing before the front door crashed open. The sound of wood splintering echoed through the silent house like a gunshot. Heavy boots thundered onto the hardwood floors of the foyer. "Police search warrant. Is anyone home?" I froze at the top of the stairs, my hands raising instinctively. "I am here," I shouted, my voice trembling despite my training. "I am coming down. Do not shoot." 3 uniformed officers and 2 detectives in cheap suits were already swarming my living room. They looked up at me, guns drawn, flashlights blinding me. Aaliyah King, one of the detectives, barked. He was a thick-set man with a mustache that looked like a bristly caterpillar. "Yes," I said, walking down the stairs, slowly counting my breaths. 1, 2, 3. Keep the heart rate down. Observe. Analyze. "You are under arrest for grand larceny, embezzlement, and wire fraud," he announced, holster his weapon but keeping his hand near it. "Turn around and place your hands behind your back." Embezzlement. I asked, the word tasting like ash in my mouth. I reached the bottom step. I stopped. "There has to be a mistake. I work in data entry." The detective laughed, a dry, humorless sound. He stepped forward, grabbing my wrist and spinning me around. The cold metal of the handcuffs bit into my skin, pinching the delicate nerves. "We know where you work, Mrs. King," he said, reciting the Miranda rights in a bored monotone. "And we know about the transfers. $200,000 moved from Archer Logistics into your personal savings account yesterday morning." My mind clicked into gear. 200,000. Yesterday morning. Archer Logistics. That was Dante's company. I did their bookkeeping on the weekends to save them money on a CPA. I had access to the accounts. I had the passwords. But I hadn't moved a dime. I had been auditing the books privately, noticing discrepancies, noticing small bleed-outs of cash that I assumed were just Dante being sloppy with expenses. I looked up as they marched me toward the door. And then I saw him. Dante was standing in the kitchen doorway. He wasn't in his office suit. He was wearing jeans and a t-shirt, looking disheveled, his eyes red and puffy. He looked like a broken man. He looked like a husband who had just discovered his wife was a criminal. "Dante." I called out, watching his performance with a mix of horror and professional admiration. Tell them I didn't do this." He looked at me, and then he looked at the floor, shaking his head. A single perfect tear rolled down his cheek. "I trusted you, Aaliyah." He choked out, his voice cracking beautifully. "I gave you access to everything. How could you steal from me? How could you steal from the company? My partners are going to ruin me." He looked up at the detective. "Is it true? Did you find the money in her account?" The detective nodded sympathetically. "It is all there, Mr. King. The transfer logs, the IP address. It all traces back to her laptop. We have seized it as evidence." Dante covered his face with his hands. "I did not want to believe it," he sobbed. "I tried to tell you she was innocent, but the evidence—" "Oh God, Aaliyah, why was my salary not enough for you?" I stared at him. The sheer audacity of it took my breath away. He had framed me. He had used my own login credentials, which he had because I trusted him to transfer money he had likely stolen himself into my account. He was washing his hands of his own crimes and drying them on my reputation. He dropped his hands from his face. For a split second, just as the officer pushed me forward, Dante's eyes locked with mine. The sorrow vanished. The redness cleared. And there it was, the smirk, the triumphant, malicious glint of a predator who has just trapped its prey. He winked, a tiny, almost imperceptible wink. My blood ran cold. He didn't just want to leave me. He wanted to destroy me. He wanted to pin his debts and his failures on me so he could walk away clean with the insurance money or whatever deal he had cut. But the knife in my back wasn't done twisting yet. As the officers led me to the front door, the cool night air hitting my face, I saw a movement on the porch. Someone was standing in the shadows watching the show. It was Chloe. She was leaning against the porch railing, holding a mug of tea. She looked comfortable. She looked settled. And she was wearing my silk kimono. Not the one I had on, but the vintage Japanese silk robe I kept in the guest room, the one my grandmother had left me. It was a sacred object, and she had it wrapped around her body like a trophy. She blew on the steam rising from the mug, her eyes meeting mine. She didn't look away. She smiled a slow, lazy smile of a woman who has just moved from the sidelines to the main stage. She took a sip of tea, her pinky finger extended, mocking the class she desperately wanted to possess. "Rough night?" she asked softly as I passed her. I stopped. The officer tugged at my arm, but I planted my feet. I looked from Dante, who was now standing in the doorway behind me, to Chloe on the porch. The picture was complete. They weren't just lovers, they were co-conspirators. This wasn't a crime of passion. It was a heist, and I was the vault they had just cracked open. "Get your hands off my robe," I said. My voice was low, deadly quiet. It didn't sound like me. It sounded like the ghost. Chloe laughed. "It is evidence now, sweetie. Everything in that house is evidence. Or collateral. Dante says I can pick out new curtains once you are gone. I never liked that beige color anyway." "Keep moving," the officer barked, shoving me toward the patrol car. I stumbled down the walkway, my bare feet scraping against the concrete. The neighbors were out. Mrs. Higgins from next door was peering through her blinds. The Johnsons were standing on their lawn in their pajamas, phones out recording. I was being paraded. The quiet, respectable Aaliyah King was being hauled away like a common thug. They pushed me into the back of the cruiser. The hard plastic seat was cold and smelled of disinfectant and vomit. The door slammed shut, sealing me inside a cage of plexiglass and metal. I watched through the window as Dante walked out onto the porch. He put his arm around Chloe. He kissed her forehead. He looked at the police car and shook his head sadly, playing the victim until the very end. He handed the detective a flash drive. My stomach tightened. That drive probably contained the doctored spreadsheets, the fake emails, the entire fabricated paper trail he had spent weeks creating while I was sleeping next to him. The engine roared to life. The siren chirped. As the car pulled away, I didn't look back at the house. I didn't look at the man I had vowed to love and cherish. I closed my eyes and retreated into my mind. I stripped away the emotion. I stripped away the hurt. I stripped away the wife. Dante had made a critical error in his calculations. He thought he was framing a data entry clerk. He thought he was framing a woman who didn't understand how money moved. He thought the $200,000 was the smoking gun. But he didn't know that my personal tracking software installed on the very laptop he had just handed over to the police mirrored every keystroke to a cloud server in Zurich. He didn't know that every time he logged in as me, the biometric typing cadence analysis flagged it as an intruder. He didn't know that the money he transferred didn't come from the company's operating account. I opened my eyes as the cruiser turned the corner, the lights of my house fading into the distance. He had transferred the money from a honeypot account I had set up inside the company's ledger months ago, a dummy account designed to catch thieves. He hadn't stolen from the company. He had stolen marked digital bills from a trap I had built for someone else. He thought he was sending me to prison. In reality, he had just handed the police a signed confession with a timestamp. But I couldn't use that yet. Not yet. I needed him to feel safe. I needed him to overreach. I needed him to bring the rest of the rats out of the woodwork. I needed Jessica and his mother to get involved. I needed them to put their names on the assets he was about to try and steal. "Let him have his night," I whispered to the empty car. "Let him have his applause." I leaned my head against the window, the vibration of the road humming against my skull. The handcuffs were tight, but my mind was loose, limber, and ready for war. Call the lawyer, I thought, drafting the mental email. Initiate Protocol Obsidian. Freeze the offshore accounts. Flag the domestic assets. Dante King had just declared war on a nuclear power, and he was attacking me with a slingshot. The car sped up, merging onto the highway toward the county jail. I watched the city lights blur into streaks of gold and red. I wasn't Aaliyah the victim anymore. I was Aaliyah the architect of his destruction. And as I sat in the dark watching the world rush by, I realized something that made me smile in the shadows. He didn't check the shoebox. He said he found the $50,000, but he didn't check under the lining of the box. He didn't find the encrypted USB drive that contained the real ledger. The one that showed not just his embezzlement, but the money laundering scheme his boss was running. The one that linked Archer Logistics to shell companies in the Caymans. He had framed me for stealing crumbs, unaware that I held the map to the entire bakery. I settled into the hard seat. The fear was gone. The shock was gone. All that was left was the cold mathematical certainty of revenge. I hope you enjoy the robe, Chloe, I thought, because it is the only thing you are going to be wearing when I am done with you. The receiver of the payphone felt greasy against my ear, a cold, heavy plastic brick that smelled of stale breath and hopelessness. I stood in the intake holding area of the Fulton County Jail, surrounded by women who were screaming, crying, or staring blankly at the cinder block walls. The air was thick with the smell of industrial disinfectant and unwashed bodies. I pressed the receiver tighter against my ear, trying to block out the noise of a woman 3 feet away who was begging her mother to post bail. I dialed the number for Silas Thorne. Silas was not just a lawyer. He was a shark in a 3-piece suit, the kind of man you called when you needed a problem to disappear, not when you needed to negotiate a plea deal. I had kept him on a monthly retainer of $5,000 for 6 years, specifically for a moment like this. He knew me as the ghost. He knew that if I was calling from a correctional facility, the world was about to burn. I waited for the connection tone. I waited for the automated voice to ask for my name. Instead, I heard 3 sharp beeps followed by a recorded message that made my blood run cold. The number you are trying to reach has been restricted by the account administrator. If you believe this is an error, please contact your legal guardian. I pulled the phone away from my ear and stared at it. Account administrator, legal guardian, Dante. My mind raced, connecting the dots faster than a supercomputer. When the police arrested me, they had likely classified me as a flight risk, or based on Dante's lies about my mental instability, a danger to myself. In cases where a spouse claims mental incompetence during an arrest, especially involving large sums of money, they can petition for emergency temporary guardianship. It was a rare maneuver, usually reserved for the elderly or the severely mentally ill, but Dante was a salesman. He could sell ice to a polar bear, and he had clearly sold the narrative of a hysterical, erratic wife to the arresting officers and the night judge. He had locked down my communication. He had put a block on the outgoing calls to anyone who wasn't on an approved list. And I knew with sickening certainty that the only person on that approved list was him. I dialed again. This time I tried the number for my private banker in Zurich, restricted. I tried my own cell phone, hoping to access voicemail, restricted. He had encased me in concrete. He wanted me isolated. He wanted me to feel small, alone, and dependent on his mercy. He wanted me to sit in this cell and stew until I was ready to sign whatever confession he put in front of me, just to get a phone call. I hung up the phone. The metallic click sounded like a prison door slamming shut. "Hey, Hollywood." The voice came from the guard station. It was Officer Miller, a woman with a buzz cut and a look of permanent exhaustion. She was leaning back in her chair, her feet up on the desk, holding her personal smartphone. She was laughing a cruel, wheezing sound. "You are famous, Hollywood," she shouted, waving me over. "Your husband is putting on quite a show." I walked over to the plexiglass divider separating the holding cell from the guard station. My heart hammered a slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs. "What are you talking about?" I asked, my voice steady. Miller turned her phone around and pressed it against the glass. "Look at this. It is trending on TikTok. 10,000 views in 20 minutes. I looked at the small screen. The video was shaky, filmed in vertical portrait mode. It was my front lawn. Dante was standing in the middle of the grass, holding a megaphone in one hand and a glass of champagne in the other. He was wearing sunglasses even though it was night. The porch lights flooded the yard, turning it into a grotesque stage. "Everything must go," Dante shouted into the megaphone, his voice distorted and tinny. "We are cleansing the house of bad energy. We are getting rid of the thief's trash." Behind him, Chloe was running out of the front door. She was carrying armfuls of my clothes, my work blazers, my sensible slacks, the floral dresses I wore to church to keep up appearances. She was laughing, spinning in circles, and then launching them into the air. I watched as my wardrobe rained down onto the wet grass. "Look at this junk," Dante yelled, kicking a pile of my sweaters. "Polyester. Off-the-rack garbage. Who wants it? $5 for the whole pile." The camera panned to the street. A small crowd had gathered. Neighbors, teenagers, people walking their dogs. Some were laughing. Some looked horrified. But no one stopped him. Chloe ran back into the house and emerged with a cardboard box. I recognized it immediately. It was the box from my closet where I kept my personal journals and the few mementos I had from my mother. It contained her old Bible, her reading glasses, and the scarf she was wearing when she died. They were worthless to anyone else, but they were the only things I would have run into a burning building to save. "Check this out," Chloe shrieked, digging into the box. "Look at this old rag." She pulled out my mother's scarf. It was a simple silk square, faded and fraying at the edges. Dante grabbed it from her. He held it up to the camera lens. "This is what a fraud looks like, people," he sneered. "She steals 200 grand from my company, and she hoards trash like this. It smells like mothballs and poverty." He threw the scarf on the ground. Then he did something that made the air leave my lungs. He poured his champagne on it. I watched the liquid soak into the faded silk. I watched him stomp on it with his designer loafers, grinding the fabric into the mud of the front lawn. In the comments section, scrolling up the side of the video, I saw the hearts, the laughing emojis, the fire symbols. Strangers were cheering him on. "He is really cleaning house," one comment read. "She deserves it," wrote another. Officer Miller pulled the phone away, chuckling. "That is cold," she said, shaking her head. "He is selling your furniture too. I saw another video where he sold your dining table for $50, said it was tainted." I stepped back from the glass. The noise of the jail faded away. The screaming women, the clanging doors, the smell of bleach, it all disappeared. All I could see was my mother's scarf in the mud. All I could see was the joy on Dante's face as he erased me. He wasn't just selling my things, he was performing an exorcism. He was trying to scrub Aaliyah, the wife, out of existence so he could replace her with Chloe. He was publicly shaming me, stripping me of my dignity, making sure that when I eventually got out, I would have nothing to return to. No clothes, no heirlooms, no history. He thought he was breaking me. He thought that by destroying the trappings of my humble life, he was destroying my soul. But Dante had made a critical miscalculation. He was destroying Aaliyah, the data entry clerk. He was destroying the costume I had worn for 5 years to make him feel comfortable. He was burning the disguise that had kept him safe from the truth. I looked at my reflection in the darkened plexiglass. My face was calm. My eyes were dry. He had just freed me. By destroying the wife who clipped coupons and wore polyester, he had removed the last reason I had to show him mercy. He had severed the final tether of guilt that might have made me hesitate. I turned away from the guard station and walked back to the metal bench in the corner of the cell. I sat down and folded my hands in my lap. Let him sell the furniture, I thought. I owned the warehouse where the furniture was made. Let him burn the clothes. I owned a controlling stake in the textile distributor that supplied the brand. Let him stomp on the scarf. That was the only thing he couldn't pay for. And that was the only thing that was going to cost him everything. I closed my eyes and began to hum a low, quiet tune. It was a song my mother used to sing. I needed to center myself. I needed to wait. The phone block was a nuisance, but it was temporary. Every system had a back door, every wall had a crack, and Dante, in his arrogance, had forgotten that he wasn't the only one with connections. I looked across the cell. A young woman with pink hair and a nose ring was staring at me. She had been crying earlier, but now she looked curious. She had seen the video, too. She had seen the guard mocking me. "Your man is a dog," she whispered. I looked at her. I didn't smile. "He is not a dog," I said softly. "A dog is loyal. He is a parasite." I leaned back against the cold cinder block. "And the thing about parasites," I continued, my voice barely audible over the din of the jail, "is that they die when the host decides to take medicine." I looked at the payphone again. I didn't need to call Silas Thorne yet. I just needed to wait for the arraignment. I just needed one moment in front of a judge. Dante was having his party on the lawn. He was drunk on champagne and power. He didn't know that the livestream was being recorded by my security algorithms. He didn't know that by destroying my property on camera, he was adding destruction of evidence and malicious tort to his list of crimes. He thought he was burying me, but he was just planting seeds, and the harvest was going to be biblical. While I sat on a steel bench in a holding cell staring at a water stain on the ceiling that looked like a weeping angel, my home was being invaded. I did not need to be there to see it. I did not need a crystal ball. I knew Jessica and Lucille better than they knew themselves. I knew their greed. I knew their envy. And thanks to the hidden cameras equipped with motion sensors in every room of my house, I would later watch every single second of their violation in high definition. The police lights had barely faded from the street before Jessica's SUV pulled into my driveway. She didn't park on the street. She pulled right up onto the grass, her tires tearing up the landscaping I had planted with my own hands. She wasn't just coming to visit, she was coming to loot. Inside the house, the air was still vibrating with the tension of my arrest. Dante was likely in the kitchen pouring himself another drink, but Jessica had a different mission. I could imagine her walking through the front door, her heels clicking aggressively on the hardwood. She wouldn't look at Dante. She wouldn't ask if he was okay. Her eyes would go straight to the staircase. For 3 years, Jessica had been obsessed with a specific item of mine. It was a vintage Cartier tank watch, a 1920s original with a platinum case. I had worn it exactly once to a family charity gala. Jessica had grabbed my wrist that night, her nails digging into my skin, and asked if it was real. I told her it was a replica I found at a flea market. She sneered and let go, but I saw the hunger in her eyes. She knew. Deep down, her instincts for expensive things told her it was real, and it drove her mad that the data entry clerk had something she didn't. Now with me in a cage, she had her chance. I visualized her running up the stairs, bypassing the guest rooms, and bursting into my private dressing room. This was my sanctuary. It was where I kept my books, my sewing machine, and the small collection of things that were just for me. Jessica would tear it apart. On the security footage I reviewed later, the violence of her search was breathtaking. She didn't open drawers, she ripped them out. She dumped my underwear on the floor, kicking aside my sensible cotton briefs with disgust. She swept my makeup off the vanity, sending bottles of foundation shattering against the wall. "Where is it?" she muttered. Her voice distorted by the camera's microphone, but clear enough to hear the desperation. "Where did you hide it, you little rat?" She tore the clothes from the hangers. My blazers, my skirts, the silk blouses I saved for special occasions. She threw them behind her like trash. She was panting frantic. She wasn't looking for evidence of my alleged crimes. She was looking for her inheritance. She found the false bottom in the jewelry box. I had not made it difficult to find. I knew that if a burglar ever came, they would check there first. She let out a squeal of triumph that sounded inhuman. She pulled out the velvet pouch. She dumped the contents into her palm. There it was, the watch. She held it up to the light, her eyes wide with greed. She didn't care that her sister-in-law was in jail. She didn't care that her brother was allegedly the victim of a massive fraud. She only cared that the platinum was cold against her skin. "It is too nice for her," Jessica whispered to the empty room, fastening the watch around her wrist. "It looks better on me. She doesn't even know how to tell time on a dial like this." She admired her wrist, twisting it back and forth. Then she did something that made my blood boil colder than the jail cell air. She walked over to my full-length mirror, posed with her hand on her hip, and took a selfie. Down the hall, a different kind of invasion was happening. Lucille, my mother-in-law, had not gone for the jewelry. Lucille cared about territory. For years, she had made snide comments about my house. She said it was too big for me. She said the master bedroom had the best light, and it was a waste that I, a woman who worked all day, got to sleep there. She walked into the master bedroom with the entitlement of a queen returning from exile. Dante was downstairs, but Lucille didn't care. She walked to the bed I had shared with her son, the bed where I had read late into the night, and she stripped it. She pulled the duvet cover off, bunching it up in her arms and throwing it into the hallway. "Filthy," she spat. "Everything she touches is cheap." She opened the linen closet and began pulling out the new sheets, the high thread count Egyptian cotton sheets I had bought for guests. She began to remake the bed. My bed. "I am moving in tonight, Dante," she shouted down the stairs, her voice echoing through the house. "Someone needs to manage this household while you deal with the lawyers. You cannot be expected to live here alone in this squalor." She sat on the edge of the mattress, bouncing slightly to test the springs. She looked around the room, mentally rearranging my furniture. She pointed a manicured finger at my reading nook. "That chair goes," she said to herself. "And those hideous curtains. We will put the antique vanity there, the one she refused to let me bring over last Christmas." She was erasing me. She was nesting in the warm spot I had just been dragged out of. But the climax of their raid happened 20 minutes later. Jessica and Lucille collided in the hallway. Jessica was wearing my watch. Lucille was holding my favorite throw pillow, ready to toss it in the trash. "We should check the closet in the office," Jessica said, her eyes gleaming. "If she had the watch, she might have cash. Dante said she stole 200 grand. She couldn't have spent it all." They marched into the small home office I used for my data entry work. They ignored the computer. They ignored the file cabinets. They went straight for the closet, where I kept the vacuum cleaner. Jessica fell to her knees, pulling up the carpet in the corner. She was smarter than I gave her credit for. She knew that the floorboards in these old houses were loose. There she shouted. Beneath the loose boards cemented into the subfloor was a small, fireproof safe. It wasn't the digital kind. It was an old-fashioned dial safe, heavy and stubborn. They didn't have the combination. But they had a crowbar from the garage. I watched on the playback as the two women dressed in their expensive dinner party clothes sweated and grunted, prying at the door of the safe. They looked like feral scavengers. Jessica braced her foot against the wall, heaving with all her might. Lucille cheered her on. "Break it open," Lucille hissed. "It is probably where she hid the cash." With a loud crack of tortured metal, the lock gave way. The door swung open. They both lunged forward, their hands grabbing at the contents. They expected stacks of $100 bills. They expected diamonds. They expected the spoils of the theft I was accused of. Instead, they pulled out a stack of thick, legal-sized envelopes. Jessica ripped the top one open, her hands shaking. She pulled out the document. It was a property deed. But it wasn't for a house. It was for a commercial lot downtown, a vacant warehouse district that was currently being redeveloped. She squinted at the paper, trying to read the legal jargon. "What is it?" Lucille asked, peering over her shoulder. "Is it bonds? Is it stocks?" Jessica frowned. "It says lien. It says mortgage assignment. And look at the numbers." She pointed to the figure at the bottom of the page. $4 million. She gasped. "Oh my God." "Lucille, look." Lucille grabbed the paper. $4 million. She owes $4 million. They dug deeper into the safe. They found another document. This one was a deed for an apartment complex in Chicago. Value $12 million. Holder Ghost Shell, LLC. They froze. They looked at each other, and then slowly a smile began to spread across Jessica's face. A nasty, superior, delighted smile. "She doesn't have money," Jessica laughed, the sound bubbling up from her chest. "She is drowning in debt. Look at this Ghost Shell, LLC. That sounds like a loan shark company." She waved the papers in the air. "She is broke." Jessica shrieked with laughter. "She has been taking out loans she can't pay. That is why she stole from Dante. She is trying to pay off these people." Lucille snatched the papers back, her eyes scanning the lines but missing the most important word, grantee. She saw the dollar signs and the complex legal names, and her limited financial literacy filled in the blanks with what she wanted to be true. "She is in over her head," Lucille said, shaking her head with mock pity. "No wonder she lived like a pauper. She owes millions to these companies. She is worse than poor Jessica. She is a liability." They sat on the floor of my office, surrounded by the documents that proved I owned half the city block their favorite boutique stood on, and they laughed. They laughed until they cried. "This is perfect." Jessica wiped a tear from her eye. "We can show this to the judge. It proves motive. She stole Dante's money to pay her secret debts. She is going away for a long time, Mom." Lucille patted Jessica's hand. "And when she does, we will make sure Dante annuls the marriage. We don't want these debt collectors coming after the family estate. They threw the papers back into the safe, treating them like radioactive waste. They didn't realize they had just held the keys to their own salvation and thrown them away. They didn't realize that Ghost Shell LLC was me, that I wasn't the borrower, I was the bank. They stood up, dusting off their knees. "Let's go have a glass of wine," Lucille said. "I need to celebrate." I finally got my bedroom back. They walked out of the office, leaving the safe door hanging open, leaving the deeds to a $20 million portfolio gathering dust on the floor. In my cell, 12 miles away, I closed my eyes. I didn't know the specifics of their conversation yet, but I knew the feeling of the universe shifting. I felt the distinct heavy click of a trap snapping shut. They had found the truth and they had been too blinded by their own prejudice to see it. They thought they were laughing at a beggar. They had no idea they had just spit in the face of the landlord. The guard walked by my cell and banged on the bars with her nightstick. "Lights out Hollywood," she yelled. "Get some sleep. You have a big day tomorrow." I lay down on the thin, lumpy mattress. I pulled the scratchy wool blanket up to my chin. I stared at the dark wall. "Sleep well, Jessica," I whispered into the darkness. "Sleep well, Lucille. Enjoy the sheets. Enjoy the watch. Because tomorrow the rent comes due, and I am going to collect it in blood." The concept of time dissolves in a holding cell. There is no sunrise or sunset. There is only the hum of the fluorescent lights, the clanging of metal doors, and the rhythmic shifting of bodies on uncomfortable benches. It had been 6 hours since Dante had blocked my calls. 6 hours since I watched my mother's scarf being trampled into the mud on a smartphone screen. I was sitting on the concrete floor, my back against the wall, trying to mentally catalog the assets I needed to freeze the moment I walked out of there. I was building a spreadsheet in my mind, column by column, when a voice interrupted my calculations. "You look like you are doing long division in your head, sugar." I looked up. The woman sitting on the bench across from me was watching me with amused eyes. She must have been in her 60s, her hair a beautiful tapestry of steel gray and silver braids, pulled back into a messy bun. She had a kind face, but it was etched with the specific kind of weariness that comes from fighting a world that refuses to see you. She was wearing a faded floral blouse that had seen better days, and she was rubbing her swollen ankles. "My name is Miss Hattie," she said, offering me a half-eaten package of crackers. "You look like you need some salt. You are too pale." I hesitated, then took the crackers. "Thank you," I said softly. "I am Aaliyah." Miss Hattie nodded. "I know. The guard called you Hollywood, said your husband is putting on a show." She leaned forward, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Don't let them see you sweat, baby. Men like that feed on fear. If you starve them, they eventually eat themselves." I looked at her, surprised by the sudden depth of her wisdom. She wasn't just another inmate. There was a sharpness in her eyes that reminded me of my grandmother. "What are you in for, Miss Hattie?" I asked, needing a distraction from my own spiraling thoughts. She let out a dry, bitter laugh. Being old and poor in a neighborhood that suddenly decided it wanted to be rich, she gestured with her hands as she spoke. "I lived in the same apartment complex in Vine City for 20 years, paid my rent on the first of the month every month. Then this developer from New York buys the building. Ghost Shell something or other. No, wait, it was Blue Sky Ventures. That's it." My ears perked up. Blue Sky Ventures was a subsidiary of a holdings company I had investigated 2 years ago for predatory lending. "They want to renovate," Hattie continued. "They want to put in granite countertops and charge $3,000 a month. They gave us 3 days to get out. 3 days, Aaliyah. I have nowhere to go. I put my things in my car, but I forgot my insulin in the fridge." She shook her head, looking down at her hands. "I went back last night to get it. The superintendent, a boy I have known since he was in diapers, called the police. Said I was trespassing. Said I was burglarizing the unit." She sighed, a sound that carried the weight of 1,000 injustices. "The public defender came by earlier, a boy who looked like he hadn't started shaving yet. He told me to plead guilty to criminal trespass, and they might let me go with time served and probation. Guilty. For trying to get my own medicine to stay alive." I felt a familiar heat rising in my chest. It wasn't anger. It was the cold, hard engine of my profession kicking into gear. I wasn't Aaliyah the prisoner anymore. I was the ghost. I was the auditor who found the missing numbers, the broken laws, and the hidden bodies. I looked at Miss Hattie. "Did they serve you a formal eviction notice?" She shook her head. "They taped a piece of paper to the door on Monday. Said vacate by Thursday. And did the new owners return your security deposit within the 30-day window required by state law?" "No," she said, confused by the shift in my tone. "And when they arrested you, did the officers allow you to retrieve your medication? Or is it still in the apartment?" "It is still there," she said. "They wouldn't let me take anything." I stood up. My mind was racing, pulling up statutes and case law I had memorized years ago while building cases against slumlords. This wasn't just unfair. It was illegal. It was a violation of at least 4 different sections of the Georgia Landlord-Tenant Code. "Miss Hattie," I said, my voice sharp and authoritative. "Do you have a pen?" She blinked. "A pen. Honey, we are in jail. They don't give us pens. We might stab someone." I looked around the holding cell. There was a guard sitting near the door, bored, doing a crossword puzzle. I walked up to the bars. "Officer," I called out. The guard didn't look up. "Quiet down, Hollywood. I need a pen," I stated. "And I need to speak to the duty sergeant about a prisoner requiring immediate medical intervention." The guard laughed. "Medical intervention? You look fine to me." "Not for me," I said, pointing at Miss Hattie. "That woman is a diabetic who has been denied her insulin for over 12 hours. If she goes into ketoacidosis on your watch, the liability won't just fall on the department. It will fall on you personally for negligence. I am sure you don't want a wrongful death lawsuit attached to your pension file." The guard stopped writing. He looked at me, then at Miss Hattie, then back at me. He saw something in my face that made him uncomfortable. It was the look of someone who knew exactly where the lines were drawn and dared him to cross one. He grunted, stood up, and walked over. He slid a cheap blue ballpoint pen through the bars. "Make it quick," he muttered, "and if you write on the walls, you are going to solitary." I grabbed the pen. I turned back to Miss Hattie. I didn't have paper. I looked around. The only paper available was the rough industrial toilet paper in the corner stall. It would have to do. I pulled off a long strip of the tissue paper, smoothing it out on the metal bench. "What are you doing?" Miss Hattie asked, her eyes wide. "I am writing a writ of habeas corpus and a motion to dismiss based on medical emergency and constructive eviction," I said, uncapping the pen. I started to write. The ink bled slightly into the soft paper, but I pressed hard, making my handwriting small and precise. "I hereby petition the court," I muttered, as I wrote, translating the legal structures in my head onto the bathroom tissue. Defendant was a tenant at will. The landlord failed to provide the statutory 60-day notice for termination of tenancy as required by OCGA 4477. Furthermore, the landlord engaged in a self-help eviction by changing locks and denying access to life-saving medication, which constitutes a tortious act. Miss Hattie watched me, her mouth slightly open. "Aaliyah, baby, you are a data entry clerk. How do you know all those fancy numbers?" I didn't stop writing. My hand moved across the paper with a speed and confidence that betrayed my cover. I wasn't just copying words I had heard on TV. I was citing specific subsections of the official code of Georgia Annotated. I was referencing precedents. "I read a lot," I said, not looking up. "And in my line of work, you learn that the only difference between a criminal and a CEO is a good lawyer. Since you don't have one, I am going to be one for the next 10 minutes. I finished the first page and pulled off another strip. The other women in the cell had gathered around. They were silent, watching the blue ink fill the white paper. They sensed the power shifting. They sensed that the quiet woman in the corner wasn't a victim. She was a weapon. I continued writing. "The arrest for criminal trespass is invalid, as the defendant had established residency and was never legally evicted. The entry into the domicile was under the doctrine of necessity to preserve life. We demand immediate release on own recognizance and police escort to retrieve medical supplies." I signed the bottom of the toilet paper with a flourish. Aaliyah King, acting as friend of the court. I handed the fragile scroll to Miss Hattie. "When the public defender comes back, or when they take you to the arraignment judge tomorrow morning, you do not say a word. You just hand them this." Miss Hattie took the paper. Her hands were shaking. She looked at the legal jargon scrawled on the toilet tissue. It was ridiculous. It was impossible. And yet, it read like a death sentence for the landlord's case. She looked up at me, tears welling in her eyes. "Who are you, really?" she whispered. "You are not just some wife who got framed. You talk like the people who own the buildings, not the people who clean them." I sat back down, the adrenaline fading into a cold, steady resolve. I thought about Dante. I thought about how he believed he was the smart one. I thought about how he believed power came from shouting into a megaphone or wearing a suit. He didn't understand that real power was knowledge. Real power was knowing the rules of the game so well that you could break them and make the referee apologize. "I am just a woman who pays attention." "Miss Hattie?" I said softly. I looked at the pen in my hand. I wasn't done. I turned the paper over. "Does anyone else have a landlord problem?" I asked the room. A young girl with tattoos on her neck raised her hand timidly. "My baby daddy took my car. He says because he paid the down payment, it is his, but the title is in my name." I pulled off another strip of toilet paper. "Sit down," I said. "Let's talk about the definition of conversion of property and Title 40 regarding motor vehicles." For the next 3 hours, the holding cell turned into a law firm. I wrote motions on napkins. I wrote demand letters on the back of gum wrappers. I drafted affidavits on paper towels. I wasn't just helping them, I was sharpening my sword. Every statute I cited, every loophole I exploited was a warm-up for the war I was about to wage on Dante. Miss Hattie sat beside me, holding her toilet paper writ like it was the Declaration of Independence. She looked at me with a mixture of awe and fear. "Girl," she whispered, "when you get out of here, God help whoever put you in." I smiled a tight, dangerous smile. "God can't help him, Miss Hattie. He is going to need a forensic accountant, and unfortunately for him, I am the best one in the state." The guard walked by again, looking at the women huddled around me. He frowned. "What is going on in there?" he barked. "Nothing, officer," I said, capping the pen and sliding it into my sock. "Just a book club." I leaned back against the wall. I was ready. I had my team inside. I had my plan. And tomorrow, when I walked into that courtroom, I wasn't going to be the defendant. I was going to be the prosecution, the judge, and the jury. And Dante King was about to find out that he had locked a wolf in the henhouse. The metal door of this consultation room groaned open 20 hours after my arrest. I was sitting at the scarred wooden table, my hands folded, waiting for Silas Thorne. I had assumed that my message via Miss Hattie's toilet paper writ had reached the outside world, or that Silas had simply seen the news and come running. I expected a man in a $3,000 Italian suit who smelled of sandalwood and expensive tobacco. Instead, a man walked in who looked like he had slept in his car. He was short, sweating profusely despite the air-conditioned chill of the jail, and wearing a suit that was 2 sizes too big for him. His tie was stained with what looked like mustard, and he was carrying a battered briefcase that wouldn't close properly. "Mrs. King," he wheezed, dumping a pile of disorganized files onto the table. "I am so sorry I am late. Traffic was a nightmare. I am Arthur Polson. Your husband hired me." I stared at him. My husband hired him. That was the first red flag. If Dante was paying for my defense, he wasn't paying for an acquittal. He was paying for a burial. "I did not ask for you, Mr. Polson," I said. My voice cool. "I have my own counsel." Arthur Polson waved a dismissive hand, wiping sweat from his forehead with a crumpled handkerchief. Yes, Dante mentioned you might be confused. He said you have been talking about high-powered lawyers and secret bank accounts. It is okay. That is why I am here, to help you navigate this episode. He emphasized the word episode with a pitying smile that made my skin crawl. He sat down, opening a file that contained a single thin piece of paper. "Now, Aaliyah. Can I call you Aaliyah?" he began, not waiting for an answer. "I have looked at the charges. Grand larceny, wire fraud. It looks bad, very bad. The prosecutor is talking about 15 years. He paused for dramatic effect. I didn't blink. I knew the sentencing guidelines better than he did. For a first-time offender with no prior record, 15 years was a negotiation tactic, not a reality. But he was trying to scare me. However, Polson continued leaning in. "Dante loves you very much. He is heartbroken, truly. He wants to bring you home, and he and I have come up with a strategy that will make this whole nasty business go away." He slid the paper across the table. It wasn't a bail application. It wasn't a motion to dismiss. It was a plea agreement. I looked at the header. Guilty by reason of mental defect. I read the terms. Aaliyah King, admit to the misappropriation of funds due to a temporary psychotic break induced by stress and undiagnosed bipolar disorder. I agree to immediate remand to a psychiatric facility for a period of no less than 6 months under the conservatorship of my spouse. I looked up. The room went silent. "You want me to plead insanity?" I asked. Polson smiled, nodding vigorously. "It is the best way, Aaliyah. If we go to trial, they will destroy you. But this This is a medical issue. You go to a nice private clinic, you get some rest, you get some medication, and Dante takes care of everything while you recover. Takes care of everything, I repeated slowly, including my finances. Polson shrugged. Well, naturally. As your conservator, he would need to manage your assets to pay for your treatment. It is standard procedure. I sat back. The picture was now crystal clear. Dante had realized that simply putting me in jail wasn't enough. If I went to prison, I would still own my assets. I could still manage them from behind bars through a proxy. But if I was declared mentally incompetent, if I was legally certified as insane, he would become my voice. He would gain control of the trust, the accounts, the properties, everything he suspected I had but couldn't access. He was trying to pull a Britney Spears on me. He wanted to lock me away in a medicated haze while he drained my empire dry. It is a brilliant plan, Mr. Polson, I said, pushing the paper back. But I am not crazy, and I am not signing that. The door opened again. This time there was no hesitation. Dante walked in. He looked different than he had at the house or on the live stream. He wasn't manic. He was composed, wearing a dark sweater and slacks, playing the role of the concerned, grieving husband to perfection. He nodded at the guard outside, who closed the door, giving us privacy. Baby Dante said, his voice dripping with synthetic honey. He walked over and put a hand on my shoulder. I flinched, pulling away. Don't touch me, I said. Dante sighed, looking at Polson with a see what I have to deal with expression. Aaliyah, please, Dante said, sitting in the chair next to the lawyer. Arthur is trying to save your life. You are sick. We all know it. You have been acting strange for months, hiding money, mumbling about companies you don't own. The police found the evidence. There is no evidence, Dante, I said, looking him dead in the eye, because I didn't steal anything, and you know it. Dante's face hardened. He leaned forward, his elbows on the table. The mask slipped just an inch. It doesn't matter what I know, he said softly. It matters what the court believes. And right now you look like a woman who snapped. You were hoarding trash in a shoebox. You were writing nonsense on toilet paper last night. The guards told me. He reached out and tapped the plea deal. Sign the paper, Aaliyah. Go to the clinic. It is a nice place. Jessica found it. It is in the mountains. You can paint, you can rest, and you can spend my money, I finished for him. Dante laughed a low sound. What money? The 50 grand honey that is already gone. Legal fees. He was fishing. He was desperate to know if there was more. He needed the conservatorship to find out. I am not signing, I stated. I want a trial. I want discovery. I want to see the audit trail. Polson wiped his face again. Mrs. King, a trial is expensive and risky. Dante held up a hand to silence the lawyer. He stared at me, his eyes cold and flat. Can you give us a minute? Arthur Dante asked. Polson scrambled up. Of course. Talk some sense into her, Dante. She is in denial. The lawyer scuttled out of the room, leaving me alone with the man who had vowed to protect me until death do us part. Dante waited until the door clicked shut. Then he leaned across the table. He invaded my personal space, his cologne, a scent I used to love, now smelling like betrayal. You are going to sign that paper, he whispered. No, I said. He smiled. It wasn't a happy smile. It was the smile of a man who has an ace up his sleeve. You know, when the police searched the house, they didn't search your car, he said, his voice barely audible. They were so focused on the laptop. But I was thinking, someone as unstable as you, someone going through a psychotic break, they probably used something to take the edge off. My stomach turned over. I kept my face impassive. What are you talking about? I asked. Dante checked the door, then leaned closer, his lips inches from my ear. I went out to your Honda this morning, he whispered. I found something very disturbing under the spare tire in the trunk. It was a bag, a big bag, OxyContin, fentanyl, a lot of it Aaliyah, enough to be considered intent to distribute. I froze. This was the escalation. This was the nuclear option. Embezzlement was a white-collar crime. I could get bail, I could fight it. But drug trafficking, with a mandatory minimum sentence, I didn't put anything in my car, I said calmly. Dante shrugged. Who is the jury going to believe? The loving husband who found it and turned it in to save his wife from herself, or the crazy woman who stole from his company? He sat back, crossing his arms. Here is the choice, Aaliyah. Option A. You sign this paper, you admit you had a breakdown. We send you to the clinic. The drug charges never happen because I flush them down the toilet. You spend 6 months looking at trees and I take care of the finances. When you come out, maybe we try again. Maybe I forgive you." He paused, letting the silence hang heavy in the room. "Option B, you keep playing the victim. I call the detective right now. I tell him I found drugs in your car. They add a felony trafficking charge. You don't get bail. You go to federal prison for 20 years, and you rot in there with the real criminals." He tapped the table. "Tick-tock, baby. What is it going to be? The hospital or the cage?" I looked at him. I looked at the man I had shared a life with. He wasn't just a thief. He was a monster. He was willing to plant evidence to ruin my life forever just to get access to money he didn't earn. He was threatening to bury me under a mountain of lies so deep I would never see the sun again. Fear flickered in my chest, hot and sharp. He could do it. He had the access. He had the charm. The police already believed his narrative. But then I remembered who I was. I wasn't Aaliyah the wife. I was the ghost. And the ghost knew something Dante didn't. My car was a 2015 Honda Civic, but it wasn't stock. When I retrofitted it 3 years ago, I installed a 360-degree dash cam system that recorded to the cloud whenever the trunk was opened. It had a motion sensor. If Dante had planted drugs in my car this morning, I had video of him doing it. I looked down at the plea agreement. I needed time. I needed to get out of this room without him calling the police immediately. I needed him to think he had won just enough to lower his guard. I picked up the pen. Dante's eyes lit up. He leaned forward, hungry. "I cannot sign this today," I said, my voice trembling slightly. I put a tremor in it on purpose. "Why not?" he demanded. I need to think. It is too much. The drugs." "Dante, how could you?" He softened, thinking he had broken me. "I am doing this for you, Aaliyah. I am saving you. But I can't wait forever. Give me 24 hours, I said. Let me sleep on it. Let me say goodbye to my life. Bring the paper back tomorrow morning." Dante studied my face. He saw the fear. He didn't see the calculation behind it. He stood up, buttoning his jacket. "Tomorrow morning," he said. 9 a.m. If you don't sign it, then I make the call. And Aaliyah, don't try anything stupid. You have no one." He turned and walked to the door. Paulson was waiting outside. "She is thinking about it." Dante told the lawyer loud enough for me to hear. She just needs a night to accept her reality. The door slammed shut. I sat alone in the silence. I stared at the empty chair where my husband had just threatened to frame me for a felony. He had planted the drugs. That meant he had touched the bags. That meant his fingerprints were on them. That meant he was in possession of a controlled substance. And I had the video. I didn't need 24 hours to think. I needed 24 hours to let the trap set. I looked at the toilet paper writ I had given Miss Hattie. It was a long shot, but if I could just get in front of a judge, any judge before 9 a.m. tomorrow, Dante was going to wish he had never opened that trunk. I closed my eyes. The fear evaporated, replaced by a cold, burning focus. "You want to play dirty, Dante?" I thought. "Fine. But you brought a knife to a drone strike." I waited. I counted the minutes, and then, as if on cue, a different guard walked up to the bars. "King," he grunted. "You have a visitor." I looked up. Dante had just left. Paulson was gone. "Who is it?" I asked. The guard unlocked the door. "Some fancy lawyer in a suit that costs more than my house," the guard said. "Says his name is Thorne." I stood up. A smile touched my lips for the first time in 2 days. The cavalry had arrived, and just in time for the counterattack, the sound of chains dragging across a linoleum floor is a sound that stays with you forever. It is a metallic scraping rhythm that is designed to strip you of your humanity before you even step inside the courtroom. I walked down the center aisle of the Fulton County Courthouse wearing a bright orange jumpsuit that smelled of industrial detergent and other people's despair. My wrists were shackled to my waist. My ankles were bound together, forcing me to take small, shuffling steps. I kept my head high. I refused to look down at my feet. I refused to hunch my shoulders. I treated that aisle like a runway in Paris despite the shackles. The courtroom was packed. It was buzzing with that specific frequency of energy you only find when a scandal involving money and family hits the docket. I could feel the eyes on me, strangers who had seen the live stream, court junkies. And then in the front row, directly behind the prosecution table, I saw them. The cast of the tragedy. My mother-in-law, Lucille, was dressed in black from head to toe. She wore a hat with a small veil, as if she were attending a funeral. She was dabbing at dry eyes with a lace handkerchief, leaning heavily against Jessica for support. It was a performance worthy of an Academy Award. She looked like the grieving matriarch whose family had been destroyed by a wicked interloper. She looked fragile. She looked pious. Next to her sat Jessica. My sister-in-law had chosen a conservative navy blue dress, high-necked and demure, a stark contrast to the red gown she had worn when she spilled wine on me 48 hours ago. She wasn't wearing the Cartier watch she had stolen from my room. She was smarter than that. She was holding Lucille's hand, looking at me with a mixture of pity and horror that she was projecting for the benefit of the judge. And then there was Dante. My husband sat on the aisle seat. He was wearing the same suit he had worn to the jail, but now his tie was loosened, his hair slightly mussed. He looked exhausted. He looked like a man who had not slept because he was too busy worrying about the criminal he had married. But as I shuffled past him, the chains rattling around my ankles, he didn't look at me with sadness. He looked at me with anticipation. Beside him, closer than any friend should be, was Chloe. The audacity took my breath away for a fraction of a second. She was actually here. She was sitting in the family section wearing a soft cardigan and glasses, trying to look like a supportive assistant or a concerned family friend. But I saw her hand. It was resting on Dante's knee, hidden slightly by the fold of his jacket. Her thumb was stroking the fabric of his pants. I took my seat at the defense table. The metal chair was cold. Beside me sat Silas Thorne. Silas did not look like he belonged in a county courtroom. He looked like he belonged in a boardroom in Manhattan or on the deck of a yacht in Monaco. He was wearing a charcoal gray bespoke suit that fit him like a second skin. He had a gold pen in his hand and a leather folio open in front of him. He didn't look at the gallery. He didn't look at the judge. He was scrolling through something on a tablet with an air of complete boredom. When I sat down, he didn't turn his head. "Good morning, Mrs. King," he murmured, his voice a low baritone that projected power without volume. "I hope the accommodations were to your liking." "They were educational," I replied, keeping my eyes forward. Silas smirked. "I have reviewed the file. It is a mess. A beautiful sloppy mess. Your husband has overplayed his hand." "I know," I said. "All rise," the bailiff bellowed. The Honorable Judge Beverly Stone swept into the room. She was a stern woman with glasses perched on the end of her nose and a reputation for eating unprepared lawyers for breakfast. I had researched her years ago. She hated drama. She hated waste. And she particularly hated domestic disputes that clogged up her docket. She sat down arranging her robes and peered over her glasses at the packed courtroom. "Docket number 4492, she read. "The State of Georgia versus Aaliyah King. Charges are grand larceny, wire fraud, and embezzlement." She looked at me, then at the prosecution table. The prosecutor stood up. It was Mark Sterling. My stomach tightened. I knew Mark. He and Dante had played golf together. He had been to our house for barbecues. He was a climber, a man who used his position in the district attorney's office to do favors for friends in exchange for access to country clubs he couldn't afford. Your Honor, Sterling began buttoning his jacket and adopting a grave tone. "The state is ready to proceed. This is a tragic case of betrayal, Your Honor." The defendant. Mrs. King held a position of absolute trust within her husband's company. She used that trust to siphon funds, systematically destabilizing a local business and jeopardizing the livelihoods of dozens of employees. Sterling walked toward the jury box even though there was no jury yet. He was playing to the audience. He was playing to the cameras at the back of the room. "We have evidence that the defendant has been funneling money into offshore accounts and personal stockpiles for months," Sterling continued. "She is sophisticated, manipulative, and clearly prepared to flee." He turned and pointed a finger at me. "We also have reason to believe that the defendant is suffering from a severe mental decline, which makes her unpredictable and dangerous. Her own family is terrified of her. Her husband, Mr. Dante King, has been forced to seek a protective order. I watched Dante. He nodded solemnly, covering his face with his hand as if the shame were too much to bear. Lucille let out a small, audible sob. Jessica patted her back, glaring at me. Judge Stone looked at the defense table. "Mr. Thorne," she said, her eyebrows raising slightly as she recognized him, "I see the defendant has secured significant counsel." Silas stood up. He didn't button his jacket. He didn't pace. He simply stood there, radiating an aura of expensive confidence. "Your Honor," Silas said, his voice smooth as silk, "my client pleads not guilty to all charges. In fact, we contend that these charges are not only baseless, but are part of a coordinated effort to defraud my client of her personal assets." Sterling jumped up. "Objection. The defense is trying to turn this into a circus." "Sustained, Judge," Stone said, though she looked intrigued. "Save the opening statements for trial, Mr. Thorne. We are here for bail. Mr. Sterling, your recommendation." This was it, the moment of truth. Sterling walked back to his table. He picked up a file and looked at Dante. They exchanged a look, a microsecond of communication that screamed conspiracy. Dante gave a barely perceptible nod. "Your Honor," Sterling said, turning back to the judge, "given the nature of the crime, the amount of money missing, and the defendant's lack of local ties beyond the husband, she has defrauded the state, believes she is a massive flight risk." He paused. "We also have information that suggests Mrs. King has access to hidden funds that are unaccounted for. Therefore, a standard bail amount would be insufficient to ensure her return to court." I gripped the edge of the table. I knew what was coming. They wanted to price me out of freedom. They wanted a number so high that no data entry clerk could ever pay it. They wanted me to rot in that cell for 6 months until the trial, or until I broke down and signed the insanity plea. "The state requests bail be set at $500,000, Sterling announced. A gasp went through the courtroom. $500,000. For a first-time offender accused of stealing $200,000, it was unheard of. It was punitive. It was a ransom note disguised as a legal request. Cash only, Sterling added. No bondsman. The room erupted in whispers. Even the bailiff looked surprised. Judge Stone frowned. "Mr. Sterling, that seems excessive. The defendant has no prior record. Your Honor," Sterling pressed, his voice rising, "she stole nearly $250,000. And we believe she has more hidden. If you let her walk on a low bail, she will be on a plane to a non-extradition country by sunset. Her husband is terrified she will disappear with the rest of the family savings." He gestured to Dante. "Look at this family." "Your Honor, they are devastated. They are victims. We need to send a message that you cannot steal from your own people and just buy your way out." I looked at the front row. The mask of grief had slipped from Jessica's face. She was grinning. A nasty, triumphant grin that showed her gums. She leaned over and whispered something to Lucille. Lucille stopped crying instantly. Her eyes were bright and predatory. They did the math. They knew I didn't have $500,000. They knew the shoebox money was gone. They thought they had me. They thought I was going to spend the next year in a cage while they lived in my house, drove my car, and spent my money. Judge Stone looked at Silas. "Mr. Thorne, do you wish to be heard on the matter of bail?" Silas didn't look worried. He looked like he was deciding what to order for lunch. $500,000 is indeed a steep figure for a data entry clerk, Silas drawled. "However, if the state insists on that number to ensure my client's presence, we are prepared to address it." Sterling smirked. "Address it how, Mr. Thorne? Does she have a rainy day jar we don't know about?" Laughter rippled through the gallery. Dante chuckled, shaking his head. He put his arm around Chloe, pulling her close, not even hiding it anymore. He felt safe. He felt victorious. He was looking at me with eyes that said, "I told you so." He mouthed the words to me across the aisle. "Sign the papers." He was telling me that this was my last chance. If I didn't agree to the insanity plea, if I didn't let him take control, I was going back to the cell. He was dangling my freedom in front of me, and the price was my soul. I looked at him. I looked at the hand resting on Chloe's waist. I looked at the suit I had bought him. I looked at the arrogance that oozed from his pores. He really thought I was broke. He really thought that because I clipped coupons I didn't have capital. He really thought that because I didn't flash wealth I didn't possess it. The anger inside me, which had been a roaring fire, suddenly cooled into something solid and sharp like a diamond. I didn't feel like crying. I didn't feel like begging. I felt like buying the building. I leaned over to Silas. "Do it," I whispered. Silas nodded. He stood up again. "Your Honor," he said, his voice cutting through the murmurs. "While we find the state's request absurd and clearly vindictive, my client does not wish to waste the court's valuable time arguing over price tags." He paused. "However, since Mr. Sterling has raised the issue of financial solvency and hidden assets, I believe it is important to clarify the source of funds." Sterling rolled his eyes. "Your Honor, unless the defense has a pot of gold, can we move on?" Silas ignored him. He reached into his leather folio. He didn't pull out a plea deal. He didn't pull out a request for a bail reduction. He pulled out a checkbook. It wasn't a personal checkbook. It was a large, leather-bound binder used for corporate accounts. I watched the color drain from Dante's face. He recognized the binder. He had seen it once years ago in a safe deposit box I told him belonged to a client. Silas opened the binder. He took out his gold pen. "My client is prepared to post the full amount of $500,000 immediately," Silas said calmly, "by certified draft." Silence slammed into the courtroom like a physical blow. Judge Stone blinked. "Excuse me? Mr. Sterling asked for $500,000 cash," Silas repeated, writing on the check with a flourish. "We accept." Sterling stood there, his mouth opening and closing like a fish. "But how? She is a clerk. She makes $40,000 a year." Silas ripped the check from the book. The sound was loud in the quiet room. He walked up to the bench and placed the check in front of the judge. "My client's employment history is not on trial today, Mr. Sterling," Silas said. "Only her ability to post bail. As you can see, the draft is drawn on the account of Ghost Shell Holdings, a private equity firm." Judge Stone looked at the check. She looked at the amount. She looked at the signature. She looked at me. "Mrs. Yes." King, the judge asked, her voice filled with a new kind of respect. "You have authorization to sign for this company." I stood up. The chains rattled, but I didn't feel bound by them anymore. "I do, Your Honor," I said, my voice clear and strong. Sterling sputtered. "Objection. That could be a fraudulent check. We don't know who owns that company. It could be money laundering." I looked at Dante. He was gripping the seat in front of him so hard his knuckles were white. He knew. Deep down in the pit of his stomach, he was starting to realize the horror of his mistake. Ghost Shell. The name on the deed Jessica found. The name on the debt he owed. I turned to the judge. "I can assure the court the check is good." "Your Honor," I said, "I am the sole proprietor of Ghost Shell Holdings. And Mr. Sterling, if you are worried about the source of the funds, you might want to ask your friend Mr. King why his company has been paying lease payments to me for the last 6 months." Dante stood up, knocking his chair back. "What?" he shouted. "That is a lie." "Sit down, Mr. King," the bailiff barked. Judge Stone banged her gavel. "Order! Order! In my court." She looked at the check again. She looked at the prosecutor. "The bail has been tendered. Judge Stone ruled. The check is certified. The clerk will process it. Mrs. King, you are released effective immediately upon processing." I looked at the gallery. Jessica's mouth was hanging open. Lucille looked like she was about to faint. Chloe had removed her hand from Dante's leg and was edging away from him. And Dante was staring at me with the look of a man who watches a bomb fall from the sky and realizes too late that he is standing on the target. He tried to catch my eye. He tried to summon that arrogant smirk again, but his face wouldn't cooperate. He looked terrified. I didn't smile at him. I didn't frown. I simply raised my hand, the shackles still dangling from my wrist, and pointed a finger at Silas. "Get the keys." "Silas," I said loud enough for Dante to hear, "we have a board meeting to get to, and I believe I have some tenants to evict." The gavel banged again, sealing the deal. The game had changed. They had asked for a ransom thinking I was a hostage. They didn't know I was the bank. And now I was free. The air in the courtroom following Mark Sterling's demand for $500,000 was not just silent. It was vacuum sealed. It was the kind of silence that happens when a predator lunges and everyone holds their breath to see if the prey will scream. $500,000. It was a number designed to crush. It was a number designed to humiliate. It was a number that said you are poor, you are black, you are a woman, and you are going to stay in your place. I felt the weight of the eyes on me. The court reporter stopped typing her fingers, hovering over the keys. The bailiff shifted his stance, looking at me with a mixture of pity and boredom. Even Judge Stone looked uncomfortable. She adjusted her glasses, peering down at the prosecutor with a look that suggested he had overstepped the invisible line of courtroom decorum. Mr. Sterling, Judge Stone, began, her voice tight. This is a bail hearing, not an extortion racket. Unless you have concrete proof that Mrs. King is a flight risk with access to substantial liquidity, this request is bordering on constitutional violation. Sterling didn't back down. He puffed out his chest, glancing at the gallery where Dante sat. He was performing. He was earning the favor Dante had promised him. Your Honor, he said smoothly, the husband states that Mrs. King has been exhibiting erratic behavior. She has delusions of grandeur. If we set the bail at a standard $10,000, she will run. We need to make it impossible for her to flee. We are doing this for her own safety. I looked at Dante. He was leaning forward, his elbows on his knees, his hands clasped together in a prayer position that did nothing to hide the smirk twisting his lips. He was enjoying this. He was savoring the taste of my public destruction. He looked at me and his eyes were dancing. He mouthed the word, checkmate. He thought he had me cornered. He thought I would turn to Silas and beg him to argue for a lower amount. He thought I would break down in tears, proving his narrative that I was an emotional wreck. He was waiting for the beg. I turned to Silas. My lawyer was already opening his mouth to object to cite the Eighth Amendment to dismantle Sterling's argument with logic and case law. I put my hand on his arm. The chains on my wrist clinked softly against the expensive fabric of his suit. No, I whispered. Silas froze. He looked at me, his dark eyes narrowing. Aaliyah, this is excessive. We can get this down to $50,000 easily. Let them have the number. I said, my voice low and hard. Silas paused. He saw the fire in my eyes. He saw the calculation. He had represented billionaires and cartel bosses, but in that moment, he looked at me with a new kind of recognition. He closed his folder. He leaned back. It is your funeral, Mrs. King, he murmured, though a ghost of a smile touched his lips. Or perhaps it is theirs. I took a deep breath. I stood up. The sound of the heavy chains dragging against the metal legs of the chair echoed through the silent room. I stood at my full height. I didn't slouch. I didn't look at the floor. I looked directly at Judge Stone. Your Honor, I said. My voice was clear. It didn't tremble. It carried to the back of the room, bouncing off the mahogany paneling. Judge Stone looked surprised. Mrs. King, you have counsel. You should let him speak for you. I appreciate Mr. Thorne's assistance. Your Honor, I continued, keeping my chin high, but I do not wish to waste the court's time arguing about the price of my freedom. If the state believes that $500,000 is the requisite amount to ensure my appearance at trial, then I accept their terms. A ripple of confusion went through the gallery. People were whispering. Was I giving up? Was I admitting I was going to stay in jail? Sterling laughed, a short, sharp sound. See, Your Honor, she is accepting her fate. She knows she can't pay. We can move to remand her immediately. I turned my head slowly and looked at Sterling. I looked at him the way a scientist looks at a lab rat that has just run into a wall. I did not say I couldn't pay, Mr. Sterling, I said. I turned back to the judge. I said I accept the terms, and I wish to satisfy the bail requirement immediately. For 3 seconds, nobody moved. The concept was too foreign. A data entry clerk in a jumpsuit accused of stealing from her husband, offering to drop $500,000 on the table like it was lunch money. Then the laughter started. It began in the front row. It began with Dante. It started as a chuckle deep in his chest, and then it exploded into a full, braying laugh that filled the courtroom. He slapped his knee. He pointed at me. He looked at his mother, then at Jessica, inviting them to join in the joke. She is crazy, Dante shouted, ignoring the decorum of the court. I told you she was crazy. Your Honor, she has $500 in a Wells Fargo account. I saw the statement yesterday. She is hallucinating. Jessica started giggling behind her hand. Lucille shook her head, looking at the ceiling as if asking God for strength to deal with her deranged daughter-in-law. The laughter spread. The court reporter smiled. The bailiff smirked. Even Sterling was shaking his head, looking at the judge with a look that said, "I told you so." "She thinks she has millions," Dante yelled, standing up now, tears of mirth in his eyes. "She thinks she is some kind of tycoon." "Aaliyah, sit down. You are embarrassing yourself. It is over." Judge Stone banged her gavel. The sound was like a gunshot. "Order Mr. King sit down, or I will hold you in contempt." Dante sat, but he was still shaking with laughter. He wiped his eyes. He looked at me with pity, real, genuine pity. He thought I had finally snapped. He thought the pressure had broken my mind, and I was now living in a fantasy world. I waited for the room to quiet down. I waited for the echoes of their mockery to fade. I didn't look at Dante. I looked at the bailiff. "May I approach the bench?" "Your Honor," I asked. Judge Stone looked at me warily. "Mrs. King, unless you have $500,000 in your pocket, I suggest you sit down and let your lawyer handle the remand paperwork." "I do not have it in my pocket, Your Honor," I said. Dante snorted loudly, but I continued, my voice cutting through his noise. "I do have the authorization key." I moved my hands. It was awkward with the handcuffs. I reached up to the neckline of my orange jumpsuit. The fabric was rough against my skin. Sterling's eyes widened. "What is she doing? She has a weapon." The bailiff took a step forward, his hand dropping to his taser. "I didn't pull out a weapon. I reached inside the lining of my bra, right where the underwire met the fabric. It was a place the female officer who searched me hadn't checked thoroughly enough. Or maybe she had, and she just didn't care about a scrap of paper. I pulled out a small folded square of yellow legal paper. It was warm from my skin. It was creased and worn. I unfolded it slowly. My fingers were steady. "This is not a delusion, Mr. King," I said, not looking back. I held the paper out to the bailiff. "This is a generated distinct authentication code for a bearer bond draft," I explained to the judge. "It authorizes the immediate release of funds from the escrow account of Ghost Shell Holdings to the clerk of the Superior Court of Fulton County." The bailiff hesitated. He looked at the judge. Judge Stone nodded. He took the paper from my hand. He looked at it. It wasn't nonsense. It wasn't a drawing. It was a string of alphanumeric characters written in precise architectural block letters, followed by a routing number that belonged to a private banking division in Zurich. "Hand it to Mr. Thorne," I instructed. The bailiff handed the paper to Silas. Silas took it. He opened his leather binder. He placed the paper next to the check he had already prepared. He punched the code into a small, secure terminal he had brought with him, a device used for high-level real estate closings. The machine beeped. A green light flashed. Silas looked up at the judge. He smiled. It was a shark's smile. "The funds are verified." "Your Honor," Silas said, "the transfer is complete. $500,000 has just been deposited into the court's holding account." The silence that followed this time was different. It wasn't the silence of anticipation. It was the silence of a bomb crater. Dante stopped laughing. His mouth was open, but no sound came out. He blinked once, twice. He looked at the paper in Silas's hand. He looked at me. He looked at his mother. Lucille had gone pale, her hand clutching her pearls. Jessica was staring at me as if I had just grown a second head. Sterling was the first to speak. "But that is impossible. She is a clerk. Where did she get—" Judge Stone was looking at her monitor. The confirmation had just popped up on her screen. She adjusted her glasses. She leaned in close to the monitor, reading the numbers. "It appears, Mr. Sterling," the judge said, her voice dry, "that the defendant is not as destitute as you claimed. The bail is posted." She looked at me. Her expression had changed. The pity was gone. In its place was a sharp, assessing curiosity. "Mrs. King," she said, "you carry $500,000 in your bra." I looked at Dante. I met his eyes. I saw the fear starting to creep in, replacing the arrogance. I saw the confusion. He was doing the math. He was trying to figure out how the woman who clipped coupons for tuna cans had just bought her freedom with a piece of scrap paper. "I don't carry money, Your Honor," I said softly. "I carry leverage." I turned my body so I was facing the gallery fully. I wanted them to see me. I wanted them to see the orange jumpsuit. I wanted them to remember this moment. Dante stood up slowly. He looked like he was going to be sick. "Aaliyah," he whispered. "What did you do?" I didn't answer him. I turned back to the bailiff. "Unlock me," I said. It wasn't a request. It was an order. The bailiff looked at the judge. The judge nodded. As the key turned in the lock and the heavy chains fell away from my wrists with a loud clatter, I rubbed my skin. I took a deep breath. I looked at the pile of chains on the floor. They looked like a dead snake. Dante was still standing there frozen. He looked at the check. He looked at the code. And then he looked at Chloe. Chloe looked terrified. She pulled her hand away from him. She sensed the shift in atmospheric pressure. She knew with the instinct of a survivor that the power in the room had just moved from the man in the suit to the woman in the jumpsuit. "I am free to go," I asked the judge. "You are, Mrs. King," Judge Stone said, "but don't leave the jurisdiction." "I have no intention of leaving, Your Honor," I said. "I have a lot of work to do." I walked over to the defense table and picked up the paper code. I folded it carefully and put it back in my pocket. Then I walked toward the exit. I had to pass Dante to get to the door. I slowed down as I reached his row. He was trembling. He reached out a hand as if to grab my arm, but then pulled it back. "Aaliyah," he hissed, "where did you get that money? Who are you working for?" I stopped. I leaned in close so only he and his mistress could hear. "I don't work for anyone, Dante," I whispered. "That is the difference between you and me. You look for a boss. I look for an investment." I straightened up. I looked at Jessica. "Nice watch," I said. Jessica covered her wrist with her other hand, her face turning crimson. I walked out of the courtroom doors. Behind me, the sound of the gavel banging dismissed the session, but the sound I focused on was the frantic whispered argument breaking out between my husband and his lawyer. He was asking how. He was asking why. He should have been asking what else, because $500,000 was just the entry fee. The real game was about to begin. And as I stepped out into the hallway, feeling the air conditioning on my skin, I reached for the phone Silas handed me. "It is time," I told him. "Call the bank. Initiate the foreclosure on the logistics center." Silas smiled. "With pleasure." I walked toward the elevator. I wasn't going home. I was going to war. And I had just fired the opening shot right into the heart of their arrogance. The processing area of the precinct was a chaotic hive of noise and misery, but I stood in the center of it with the absolute stillness of a hurricane eye. Even though I had posted bail in the courtroom, the administrative machinery of the police department was designed to grind slowly. They were stalling. I could feel it. Dante had made a call. He had used whatever meager influence he had with his golf buddies in the department to delay my release paperwork just long enough to make me suffer, or perhaps to plant the drugs he had threatened me with earlier. I stood at the intake desk. The desk sergeant was a man named Officer Miller, a guy who had spent 20 years stamping forms and ignoring pleas for help. He didn't look up when I approached. He kept his eyes on his computer screen, chewing on a toothpick that had been in his mouth since the morning shift. "Name," he grunted. "Aaliyah King," I said. "My bail has been posted. I am here for my personal effects." Miller let out a slow sigh. "King. Right. The system is down, sweetie. You are going to have to wait. Have a seat on the bench. It could be an hour. It could be 12. He smirked. It was the same smirk Dante wore. It was the smirk of a man who thought he held the keys to the cage. He knew the system wasn't down. I knew the system wasn't down. This was a power play. I looked at the clock on the wall. I didn't have 12 hours. I had a board meeting to convene and a husband to evict. I leaned over the counter. "Officer Miller," I said softly. He ignored me. "I need you to make a phone call," I said. He finally looked up, his eyes narrowing with irritation. "Look, lady, you get one call and you already made it. Go sit down before I revoke your bail for disorderly conduct." I didn't move. I reached into the pocket of the jumpsuit, which I was still wearing, because they hadn't given me back my clothes yet. I pulled out a small folded piece of paper. It wasn't money. It was a note I had written on the back of a receipt while Silas was handling the check. I slid the paper across the counter. "I don't need to call a lawyer," I said, my voice dropping to a register that commanded attention. "I need you to call the number on this paper. It is a direct line." Miller looked at the paper with disgust. "Who is it, your pastor?" "Your mommy." "It is Senator Sterling," I said. Miller froze. The toothpick stopped moving. He looked at me, really looked at me for the first time. He saw the orange jumpsuit, but he also saw the way I stood. He saw the cold intelligence in my eyes that didn't match the profile of a petty thief. The Senator Miller asked, skepticism warring with fear. "Call him," I repeated. "And when he picks up, you don't need to give him my name. Just say 3 words. The ghost is held." Miller laughed nervously. "You are crazy. Why would a senator talk to a jagged-up housewife? Tell him the Atlanta project is at risk," I added. Miller hesitated. There was something in my tone that unsettled him. It was the confidence of someone who knows where the bodies are buried because she held the shovel. He snatched the paper, muttered a curse under his breath, and picked up the receiver. I watched him dial. I watched his face. He waited. Then someone picked up. "Yeah, I have a detainee here claiming she knows you." Miller said, his tone bored. "Yeah, she says to tell you the ghost is held." "Yeah, I know it sounds—" Miller stopped. His face went drains white. His eyes bulged. He stood up straight, the toothpick falling from his mouth onto the desk. "Yes, sir." "No, sir." "I didn't know, sir." "Immediately, sir." He slammed the phone down as if it were burning his hand. He looked at me with pure terror. He didn't say a word to me. He turned and sprinted toward the back office, the glass door rattling in its frame. 10 minutes later, the heavy double doors of the precinct swung open. It wasn't Officer Miller who came out. It was the chief of police. He was buttoning his uniform jacket, his face flushed sweat beading on his forehead. He walked straight up to me, bypassing the line of lawyers and family members waiting. "Mrs. King," the chief said, his voice breathless, "I offer my sincerest apologies. There has been a terrible misunderstanding. The system glitch has been resolved immediately." He pulled a key ring from his belt. He didn't wait for a subordinate. He unlocked the final administrative cuff on my wrist himself. "Your personal effects are being brought out now," he continued, ushering me toward the exit. "And regarding the items your husband claimed to have found in your vehicle—" He paused, swallowing hard. "We have reviewed the chain of custody. We found the evidence to be unreliable. The search was conducted without a warrant, and the items have been destroyed as per protocol for contaminated evidence. There will be no additional charges." I looked at him. The drug threat was gone, vaporized by a single phone call to a man whose campaign finances I had audited and cleaned 3 years ago. "Thank you, Chief," I said. Officer Miller came running out with a plastic bag containing my clothes, my phone, and my watch. He handed them to me with trembling hands. I took the bag. I looked at Miller. "You should pick up your toothpick, officer," I said. "It is unprofessional." I turned and walked out of the station. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the city. I changed into my clothes in the back of the town car Silas had waiting for me. I put on my blazer. I put on my heels. I applied a coat of dark red lipstick. I wasn't Aaliyah the inmate anymore. I wasn't Aaliyah the wife. I was the reckoning. I told the driver the address. It was time to go home. The house was ablaze with light. Every window was glowing. Music was thumping from the living room, a bass-heavy track that rattled the windows of the car as we pulled into the driveway. They weren't just having a dinner. They were having a coronation. I saw the silhouettes moving in the window. I saw the balloons. They were celebrating my destruction. They were dancing on my grave before the body was even cold. I got out of the car. I didn't tell Silas to wait. I walked up the driveway alone. The front door was unlocked. Why would they lock it? They owned the world. I pushed the door open. The scene inside was a masterclass in betrayal. The living room furniture had been rearranged. My favorite painting, a landscape I bought in Charleston, was gone, replaced by a gaudy mirror. The coffee table was covered in empty champagne bottles and takeout containers from the most expensive steakhouse in the city. Dante was standing in the center of the room. He was holding a bottle of Dom Perignon, spraying it into the air like a race car driver. Chloe was dancing on the sofa, wearing my silk robe, the one she had paraded in the night before. Jessica and Lucille were sitting in the armchairs, clapping and laughing, their faces flushed with alcohol and greed. To the new chapter, Dante shouted, raising a toast, to getting rid of the dead weight. To the dead weight, Jessica cheered, clinking her glass against Lucille's. I stood in the entryway watching them. I let the silence stretch. I let the music play. Then I reached out and flipped the light switch, killing the dimmer setting and flooding the room with harsh, blinding brightness. The music didn't stop, but the dancing did. Dante spun around the bottle, slipping in his wet hand. Chloe froze mid-twirl. Jessica dropped her glass. They looked at me like I was a ghost. And in a way, I was. Aaliyah, Dante stammered. How? You are supposed to be in jail. The bail was paid, I said, stepping into the room. My heels clicked on the hardwood floor. Click, click, click. I walked over to the stereo system and pulled the plug. The silence that rushed back into the room was deafening. Dante recovered first. The shock turned into anger. He stepped forward, puffing out his chest. You escaped, he accused, pointing a finger at me. You broke out. That is it, isn't it? You are a fugitive. He turned to Jessica. Call the police. Tell them she is here. She is dangerous. Jessica fumbled for her phone. Oh my God, she whispered. She is going to kill us. I walked to the dining table. I picked up a glass of champagne that had been poured for me, or rather poured for the spirit of my absence. I took a sip. It was warm. I am not a fugitive, Dante, I said, calm. And you don't need to call the police. I gestured to the window. Blue and red lights were already flashing against the living room walls. But they weren't the frantic, chaotic lights of a raid. They were the steady, blocking lights of a perimeter. Dante laughed, a nervous cracking sound. See? They are here for you. You are done, Aaliyah. You can't just buy your way out of a felony. I reached into my blazer pocket. I didn't pull out a weapon. I didn't pull out a phone. I pulled out a thick-bound document. It was blue. It had a gold seal on the front. I tossed it onto the coffee table. It landed with a heavy thud, scattering the takeout containers. What is that? Chloe asked, pulling my robe tighter around her body. Dante looked at the document. He looked at the police lights outside. He looked at me. That, I said, walking around the table to stand directly in front of him, is the Articles of Incorporation for Archer Logistics. Dante frowned. I know what that is. I work there. I shook my head. No, Dante, you don't just work there. You stole from there. You embezzled $200,000 from the operational accounts. You thought you were stealing from the faceless board of directors. You thought you were stealing from old men in suits who wouldn't notice a few decimal points moving. I took another step closer. He smelled of sweat and cheap fear. But you forgot to check who bought the controlling interest in Archer Logistics 6 months ago. You forgot to check who the new chairman of the board is. Dante looked at the document again. He flipped it open. His eyes scanned the pages. His hands started to shake. He saw the signature on the bottom of the acquisition agreement, Ghost Shell Holdings, and underneath that, signed in clear black ink, Aaliyah King, CEO. He dropped the folder. He backed away, hitting the edge of the sofa. No, he whispered. No, that is impossible. You are a clerk. You are nobody. I am the bank, Dante, I said. I bought your company because I saw the potential. I kept you on because I wanted to see if you could be redeemed. But instead of working hard, you decided to cook the books. I turned to Jessica. She was clutching her phone, paralyzed. And you, I said, you are the chief financial officer. You signed off on the audits. You verified the false ledgers. Jessica shook her head violently. I just did what Dante told me. He said it was temporary. He said we were just borrowing it. I picked up the bottle of Dom Perignon Dante had dropped. I poured the remaining contents onto the floor right over his expensive Italian shoes. You weren't borrowing from the company, Dante, I said. You were stealing from me, personally. That $200,000. That was my money. That house you mortgaged. My bank holds the note. This champagne, I paid for it. The front door opened. It wasn't the police who entered first. It was Silas Thorne. He walked in holding a tablet and followed by 4 uniformed officers. Mrs. King, Silas said, nodding to me. The warrants have been executed. Warrants! Lucille shrieked, standing up. Warrants for who she is. The criminal. Silas looked at Lucille with mild amusement. Ma'am, your son is under arrest for grand larceny, corporate fraud, and embezzlement, and your daughter-in-law, Jessica, is under arrest for conspiracy to commit fraud and falsifying business records. The officers moved in. Dante tried to run. It was a pathetic attempt. He lunged toward the back door, but an officer tackled him before he made it 3 steps. They slammed him against the wall, the same wall where my painting used to hang. Aaliyah Dante screamed as they cuffed his hands behind his back. "You can't do this. We are married. You can't testify against me." I walked over to him. I leaned in close. "I am not testifying as your wife Dante," I whispered. "I am testifying as the victim of a corporate crime. Spousal privilege doesn't cover stealing from your employer." They hauled him up. He looked at me, his eyes wide with the realization of the hell he had just stepped into. "And one more thing," I said. I reached out and ripped the pocket square from his jacket. "You are fired." The officers dragged him out. He was crying now. He was begging. He was blaming Jessica. He was blaming Chloe. Jessica was next. She didn't run. She collapsed. She fell to her knees, sobbing, her hands clasping together. "Aaliyah, please," she wailed. "I have kids. We are family. You can't send me to jail. I am your sister." I looked down at her. I looked at the woman who had spilled wine on me and laughed. I looked at the woman who had raided my jewelry box. I crouched down so I was eye level with her. "Family?" I asked. I reached out and grabbed her wrist. I unclasped the Cartier watch she was wearing, my watch. I slipped it into my pocket. "Family doesn't steal, Jessica," I said softly. The officer pulled her up. The handcuffs clicked. "But we were just having fun," Jessica screamed as they dragged her toward the door. "It was just a joke. We were going to pay it back." I stood up and walked to the table where a glass of red wine was sitting. Jessica's glass. I picked it up. I swirled the liquid. I walked over to where Jessica was struggling with the officer in the doorway. "You know, Jessica," I said. I threw the wine. It splashed across her face, soaking her navy blue dress, dripping down her chin. "It is a cheap dress," I said. "At least you won't have to worry about laundry in prison." She screamed. It was a raw, primal sound of total defeat. They took her away. The room was quiet now except for the sound of Chloe weeping on the sofa. Lucille was standing in the corner. She hadn't said a word. She was staring at me with a look of absolute terror. She knew she was next. She knew she had been living in a house of cards and I had just turned on the fan. I turned to Silas. "Secure the premises," I said. "Change the locks. And verify the assets." I looked at Chloe. "You have 5 minutes to get out of my robe and get out of my house," I said. Chloe scrambled up, running toward the bathroom, tripping over her own feet. I walked to the window. I watched the police cars, lights flashing against the trees. I watched my husband and his sister being shoved into the back of the cruisers. They had wanted a tragedy. They had wanted a victim. I took a deep breath, filling my lungs with the air of my own home. It didn't smell like their cheap perfume anymore. It smelled like victory. I turned back to the empty room. "Checkmate," I whispered. The fallout of a nuclear explosion is often more devastating than the blast itself. In the weeks following the raid on my home, the dust did not settle. It choked the life out of everyone who had tried to bury me. I did not have to lift a finger to destroy them. I simply handed the evidence to the district attorney and watched gravity do the rest. Chloe was the first domino to fall completely. She had fled my house that night barefoot, clutching a bag filled with what she thought were her severance packages. She had raided my closet one last time before running stuffing a Hermes Birkin bag with 3 of my diamond tennis bracelets and a pair of emerald earrings I had bought at an auction in Geneva. She thought she could pawn them. She thought she could start a new life in Miami with the proceeds of my hard work. She made it as far as a pawn shop on the outskirts of Decatur. I wasn't there to see it, but the security footage provided by the shop owner, a man named Mr. Henderson, who I had helped with a tax audit years ago, was cinematic perfection. Chloe walked in trying to look confident, dumping the jewelry on the counter. She demanded $20,000 cash. She didn't know that every single piece of high-value jewelry I owned was micro-laser etched with a serial number registered to Ghost Shell Holdings. "Mr. Henderson didn't argue with her. He smiled, told her he needed to verify the diamonds in the back, and pressed the silent alarm. When the police arrived, Chloe didn't scream. She crumbled. She tried to tell them she was my friend. She tried to tell them I gave her the bag as a gift. But the text messages on her phone, the ones where she bragged to Dante about stealing my trash, told a different story. She was charged with grand larceny and possession of stolen property. Because the value exceeded $10,000, it was a felony. The girl who wanted to be the mistress of a mansion ended up in a cell with no view, wearing an orange jumpsuit that clashed horribly with her complexion. Then there was Lucille. My mother-in-law had spent her entire life pretending to be aristocracy. She lived on the fumes of a family name that had lost its money 2 generations ago. She thought moving into my house was her birthright. She thought she had finally reclaimed the lifestyle she deserved. 3 days after Dante's arrest, the sheriff's deputies arrived at the front door. I sat in my car across the street, the tinted windows rolled up, watching the final act of her delusion play out. Lucille opened the door wearing a silk dressing gown, looking offended that anyone would disturb her morning tea. I watched her argue. I watched her point a finger at the deputy. She was shouting that this was her son's house, that she was the matriarch, that they had no right. The deputy simply handed her a piece of paper. It wasn't a negotiation. It was a writ of possession. The house did not belong to Dante. It never had. The mortgage had been purchased by Ghost Shell Holdings, and the deed had been transferred to the LLC 6 months prior due to Dante's failure to pay the property taxes. Taxes I had stopped paying precisely to trigger this default clause. Since Dante was now in federal custody and the tenant had violated the lease agreement by conducting criminal activity on the premises, the eviction was immediate. Lucille was given 30 minutes to collect her personal belongings. I watched as she dragged 2 suitcases down the driveway. She looked small. She looked old. The neighbors, the same ones who had watched Dante sell my clothes, were now watching his mother being put out on the street. She stopped at the end of the driveway and looked back at the house. She looked at the rose bushes she had planned to dig up. She looked at the master bedroom window. She wasn't crying. She was in shock. She couldn't process a world where she wasn't the victim, but simply a trespasser who had overstayed her welcome. She got into a taxi, her head bowed, and disappeared. She moved into a 1-bedroom apartment in a neighborhood she used to make fun of, living on a state pension that barely covered the rent. But the main event was the trial of Dante and Jessica King. It was the fastest financial crimes trial in the history of Fulton County, mostly because the prosecution's star witness was the forensic accountant who had built the trap in the first place. Me. I stood on the witness stand for 3 hours. I didn't look at Dante. I looked at the jury. I walked them through the spreadsheets. I showed them the IP addresses. I showed them the emails Jessica had sent to Dante, joking about how easy it was to fudge the numbers. I dismantled their defense with the precision of a surgeon removing a tumor. Jessica broke first. In exchange for a plea deal to stay out of prison for her children's sake, she turned on her brother. She testified that Dante was the mastermind. She admitted that he had planned to institutionalize me to gain control of the trust. She admitted everything. Her deal saved her from prison, but it didn't save her life. She was stripped of her CPA license. She was ordered to pay restitution of $100,000. She was sentenced to 5 years of probation and 2,000 hours of community service. The woman who looked down on the working class was now picking up trash on the side of the highway in an orange vest, watched by the very people she used to mock. Dante, however, had no one to trade. He had been the kingpin of his own little world, and the king always goes down with the ship. The sentencing hearing was brief. Dante stood before Judge Stone, the same judge who had watched me buy my freedom. He looked thin. His suit didn't fit him anymore. His arrogance had evaporated, leaving behind a hollow, terrified shell of a man. "Mr. King," Judge Stone said, looking at him over her glasses, "you betrayed your employer. You betrayed your family. And you attempted to weaponize the legal system against your own wife to cover your greed. That is a special kind of malice." Dante tried to speak. He tried to say he was sorry. He tried to look at me, pleading with his eyes for mercy. He wanted me to stand up and ask for leniency. He wanted the wife who used to make him soup when he was sick. I sat in the front row wearing a white suit, my face impassive. I didn't move. "The court sentences you to 5 years in a federal correctional facility," Judge Stone announced, followed by 3 years of supervised release. "You are also ordered to pay full restitution to Ghost Shell Holdings in the amount of $212,000. The gavel banged. 5 years. Dante's knees buckled. The bailiff had to hold him up. As they led him away, he turned his head one last time. He screamed my name. It wasn't a scream of anger. It was a scream of regret. He realized in that final second that he hadn't just lost his freedom. He had lost the best thing that ever happened to him because he was too busy looking for something better. I walked out of the courthouse alone. The air was crisp. The sun was shining. I checked my watch. I had a meeting with my investment team in an hour. We were looking at acquiring a chain of boutique hotels in Savannah. I didn't feel sad. I didn't feel happy. I felt balanced. The ledger was finally closed. The debt was paid. And for the first time in 5 years, my net worth wasn't the only thing that was positive. My future was, too. 6 months later, I drove north. The drive to the Federal Correctional Facility took 2 hours. I enjoyed every mile. The car handled the curves of the highway with the smooth, aggressive power of a predator. It was a Porsche 911 Turbo S Jet Black with a tan leather interior. I had bought it 3 years ago and kept it in a climate-controlled storage unit, waiting for the day I could drive it without explaining how a data entry clerk could afford a $200,000 machine. I pulled into the visitor parking lot. It was filled with rusted sedans and minivans. My Porsche looked like a spaceship that had landed in a cornfield. I parked in the spot closest to the entrance. I wanted the guards to see it. I wanted the cameras to see it. I walked into the facility wearing a pair of oversized sunglasses and a dress that cost more than Dante's lawyer. The processing was slow, but I was patient. I knew the routine. I knew the smell of the bleach and the sound of the heavy doors, but this time I wasn't the one in shackles. I sat in the visitation booth. The glass was thick and scratched. 5 minutes later, the door on the other side opened. Dante walked in. He looked 10 years older. His head was shaved. His skin was sallow. The orange jumpsuit hung loosely on his frame. He shuffled to the seat and sat down. He didn't pick up the phone immediately. He just stared at me. He stared at the diamond earrings. He stared at the confident set of my shoulders. He stared at the woman he had slept next to for 5 years and realized he had never actually met her. He picked up the receiver. His hand was shaking. "Hi, Dante," I said. He licked his dry lips. "Aaliyah, you came." I nodded. "I told you I would visit." He let out a shaky breath. "It is hard in here, Aaliyah. You don't know what it is like. The noise, the food. I miss home." I didn't say anything. I let him sit in his misery. "I heard about the house," he said, his voice cracking. "Mom told me. You evicted her. I evicted a squatter, Dante. There is a difference." He winced. "Why? Why did you have to be so cruel? You won. You have the money. You have the company. Why did you have to take everything?" I leaned forward, pressing my hand against the cold glass. "I didn't take everything, Dante. I took back what was mine. There is a difference there, too." He looked down at the metal counter. "I just wanted us to be successful," he whispered. "I wanted to be the man you deserved. I thought, if I had the money, I could be that man." I shook my head slowly. "That was your mistake. You thought money made the man. You thought that if you wore the suit and drove the car, you were a king, but you were just a thief in a costume." Dante looked up, tears pooling in his eyes. "I wanted a rich wife." He admitted, his voice barely a whisper. "When I met you, I thought you were sweet, but I always wished you had more ambition. I wanted someone who could elevate me, and the whole time you were sitting on millions. Why didn't you tell me? Why did you hide it?" I looked at him with a mixture of pity and resolve, because I needed to know if you loved me or if you loved what I could buy you. I paused, letting the words sink in. "And you gave me my answer the night you planted drugs in my trunk. You didn't just want a rich wife, Dante. You wanted a victim. You wanted someone you could control." He started to cry, silent, racking sobs that shook his shoulders. "I am sorry," he choked out. "Please, can you put some money on my commissary account? I need soap. I need stamps." I looked at him. The man who had thrown my clothes on the lawn. The man who had mocked my poverty. The man who had tried to lock me away for 20 years. I stood up. I smoothed the skirt of my dress. "No, Dante." He looked up, panic in his eyes. Aaliyah, please. You have millions, just a few $100s, please. I picked up my purse. I looked at him one last time. You said you wanted a rich wife, Dante. I said, my voice cool and final. Congratulations. You finally have one. I put my sunglasses back on. But you forgot one very important thing about wealth, I added, looking down at him through the dark lenses. What he whispered. Rich people didn't get rich by letting fools spend their money. I hung up the phone. I didn't look back as I walked out of the room. I didn't look back as I walked through the heavy doors into the sunshine. I walked to my car, the heels of my shoes clicking a rhythm of absolute freedom on the pavement. I got into the Porsche. I started the engine. The roar of the motor was a beautiful sound. I pulled out of the parking lot, leaving the gray walls of the prison in my rearview mirror. I checked my phone. I had a notification. The acquisition of the Savannah hotels had gone through. I was now the owner of 3 historic properties on the waterfront. I smiled. Dante was right about one thing. It was a new chapter. But this time I was writing it alone, and the ink was gold. If you have ever had to cut off dead weight to fly, hit that like button. If you have ever been underestimated, subscribe. Because the best revenge isn't just success. It is success they can see, but never touch. My name is Aaliyah King. I am the ghost, and I am just getting started. The story of Aaliyah and Dante reveals a brutal truth about the nature of power and perception. Dante and his family were victims of their own arrogance. They looked at Aaliyah's humble exterior, her old car, her quiet job, her simple clothes, and they saw weakness. They mistook silence for submission. They were so blinded by the flashiness of wealth, by the brands and the parties, that they failed to recognize the discipline required to actually build it. This story teaches us that the loudest person in the room is often the most insecure, while the person holding the keys is usually the one standing quietly in the corner. Dante wanted a rich wife to validate his ego, but he did not understand that real wealth requires character, not just capital. He wanted the lifestyle, but he lacked the loyalty. Ultimately, Aaliyah proves that your value is not defined by how loudly you brag, but by what you can actually control. It serves as a reminder to never underestimate the person who listens more than they speak. Because while the fool is busy shouting about what they are going to do, the master has already done it. Real power does not need an audience, it just needs a plan. And as Aaliyah showed us, the best revenge is not making noise, it is making moves. If you believe that moving in silence is the ultimate power move, hit that like button. And if you want to see more stories about women taking back their control, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications. You never know when the next lesson will drop.